Humanity's oldest memories do not survive as sentences or inscriptions, but as impressions of firelight on cavern walls, as marks of pigment, as patterns of stones arranged with deliberate meaning. When our earliest ancestors first stepped into the long shadows of the unknown, they sensed that the world was not only material, but threaded with invisible currents that shaped their lives. Storms, illness, birth, death. In the slow movement of stars, all pressed upon their imaginations with a force too great to ignore. In those early ages, before writing, before cities, before the idea of civilization had even formed, human beings believed that the unseen world could be influenced if one acted with intention, rhythm, and reverence. The simple act of gathering around a fire created a boundary between what was familiar and what was mysterious. Flames flickered, smoke curled upward, and the night beyond the circle became dense with possibilities. Every rustle in the grass and every glimmer between the trees suggested the presence of forces that watched from the darkness. Rituals arose from this tension between fear and hope, a way to speak into the unknown and perhaps persuaded to become more gentle. A gesture of the hand, a whispered sound, or a painted symbol could become a bridge between the human mind and whatever lived beyond the threshold of perception. Our earliest ancestors understood the world through patterns of repetition. The sunrise returned each day. The seasons followed an unbreakable cycle, and the phases of the moon traced a soft spiral of time. These repeating motions inspired early humans to believe that their own repeated actions might echo that cosmic rhythm. If a chant matched the cadence of waves, perhaps it could call upon the same power that moved the waters. If footsteps circled a fire in harmony with the moon's shape, perhaps the moon would hear and answer. Ritual in those ancient moments was not an abstract philosophy, but a bodily participation in the pulse of nature. When archaeologists uncover prehistoric sites, they often find bones arranged in geometric formations, cagements stored in vessels, and objects placed deliberately near hearths. These discoveries suggest that early humans had already formed the basic structure of ceremonial thought, a designated sacred space, an intentional sequence of actions, and a belief that symbolic objects held influence beyond their physical form. A carved figurine was not merely a representation of a creature or a deity. It was a vessel through which unseen forces could be contacted. An ochre pattern smeared on stone was not only decoration, it was a protective barrier or an invitation. The earliest practitioners of ritual did not separate spirituality, survival, and art. These aspects flowed together as a single process of aligning human life with a greater world. A hunt required preparation, not only in physical terms, but also in symbolic ones. Before entering the forest, a group might draw lines on their arms or gather feathers to channel animal spirits. They would speak to the wind, to the earth, or to the shadows of the animals they sought. Such rites were not performed as empty traditions, They were believed to shape the outcome of the day, to soften misfortune, and to strengthen courage. Fire was among the earliest symbols of power. It provided warmth, protection, and clarity, transforming raw material into nourishment. Its unpredictable dance seemed to speak in a language no one fully understood. Humans learned that fire could purify objects, ward off unseen presences, and create an atmosphere in which ritual felt more potent. Sparks rose like stars, each one suggesting a tiny messenger carrying human intention upward. Many rituals began with the lighting of a flame, as though opening a doorway between the visible and invisible worlds. Sound also played a crucial role. A rhythmic chant echoed in the chest and created a shared resonance among participants. Early humans likely discovered that certain tones altered their emotional states, shifting fear into confidence or grief into steadiness. When several voices joined together, the air thickened with a sensation that felt larger than the individuals involved. The mind became still, the senses sharpened, and the boundary between personal and collective awareness grew thin. It is possible that ceremonial magic began as a search for this focused state, a moment when the world felt unified and permeable. Symbols gradually developed as abstract extensions of ritual intent. A mark drawn on a rock could recall a powerful moment or hold an intention for the future. When repeated across generations, these marks gained meanings that extended beyond any single person. A spiral could evoke the cycle of life. A line dividing a shape could represent the boundary between worlds. The more humans interacted with symbols, the more they believed that symbols themselves possessed influence. Over time, the idea arose that the universe responded not only to physical actions, but also to patterns of meaning. Burial sites from the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras showed that ritual extended into death as well as life. Bodies were placed with tools, pigments, and objects that seemed intended to guide the departed into another realm. This suggests that early humans believed that death was not an ending, but a passage, and that the living could assist with this transition. Such acts required both compassion and a sense of cosmic order. The placement of objects around the body followed specific patterns, implying a belief in invisible laws or pathways that needed to be honored. As communities grew more complex, so did their ceremonial structures. Ritual specialists emerged, individuals who seemed particularly attuned to trance states, symbolic insight, or the reading of signs. These early shamans, or ritual guides, carried responsibilities that blended healing, storytelling, and cosmology. They were the keepers of rhythms and the interpreters of dreams. Their presence gave structure to ceremonies, turning what began as spontaneous expressions into organized events with specific sequences and roles. Shamanic practices often involved entering altered states of consciousness. These states were achieved through drumming, dancing, fasting, or exposure to intense natural environments. In such states, practitioners reported visions of animals, ancestors, or other worlds. Whether these experiences emerged from the mind or from an unseen realm, they carried profound meaning for early societies. The shaman became a messenger who crossed the boundaries others feared to cross. This bridging role laid the foundation for later ceremonial magic, which would also rely on trained individuals navigating liminal spaces. Early humans placed great importance on the idea of reciprocity with the natural world. How to take life from the land, whether through hunting or gathering, required acknowledgement and gratitude. Rituals were performed to honor the spirits of animals, rivers, or mountains. Offerings were given to maintain balance. Such acts were not merely polite gestures, but essential exchanges that kept the fragile harmony between human survival and natural forces. Ceremony became a way to affirm that humans lived within a larger order and that their actions had consequences beyond the material. Weather phenomena inspired some of the most intense prehistoric rituals. Thunderstorms, droughts, floods, and harsh winters all affected early communities with immense power. In response, humans attempted to communicate with the forces behind these events. They called upon imagined guardians of the sky, or protectors of the harvest. They danced for rain, chanted for warmth, and created effigies to stand against destructive winds. These actions illustrate a growing belief that human intention could influence natural events through symbolic means. Stones played a central role in many early ceremonies. Large stones were arranged in circles, aligned with celestial events, or placed at significant geographical points. These monuments may have served as ritual calendars, tracking solstices or equinoxes. They may also have acted as gateways where the earthly and cosmic realms met. Standing within such circles likely generated a sense of awe and connection, as participants felt themselves woven into the motions of the heavens. These stone arrangements reflect a desire to anchor ritual within the geometry of the universe. As time progressed, ritual practices became woven into the structure of daily life. Tasks such as planting, weaving, or preparing food were accompanied by gestures or phrases believed to protect the work or encourage success. The boundary between ordinary tasks and ceremonial acts remained fluid. Even simple actions could become potent if performed with intention. This integration of ritual into everyday life ensured that symbolic thought shaped every aspect of existence. The development of agriculture transformed human communities, and with it, their ceremonial practices. Settled life required a deeper understanding of seasons, soil, and weather patterns. Rituals grew more elaborate, involving extended celebrations or communal gatherings that honored the cycles of planting and harvest. These events strengthened social bonds and confirmed a shared belief in a cosmic order that supported human life. The stability of settled settlements allowed rituals to accumulate layers of meaning, becoming traditions passed across generations. The concept of sacred direction emerged as humans paid closer attention to the sky. The rising of the sun in the east, the setting in the west, the position of stars, and the movement of constellations influenced the placement of ritual spaces and the orientation of ceremonial acts. East became associated with beginnings, west with endings, and the north and south took on symbolic qualities shaped by local landscapes. By aligning themselves with these celestial markers, early practitioners believed they were aligning with forces larger than themselves. Objects used in ceremonies became increasingly specialized. Stones were polished, bones were carved, feathers were arranged, and vessels were shaped with intricate designs. Each object held a purpose: protection, guidance, healing, or empowerment. The creation of these objects required skill and attention, teasing the idea that intention must be embedded in the tools of ritual. Over time, certain materials were believed to possess inherent properties. Crystals, metals, and rare pigments took on mythic significance, reflecting the growing complexity of symbolic thought. As villages turned into settlements and settlements into early cities, the functions of ritual expanded from personal and communal needs into social and political realms. Leaders relied on symbolic ceremonies to affirm their authority or to connect themselves to divine powers. Ritual became a means of communication not only between humans and the unseen world, but also between rulers and the people they governed. This shift marked an important transformation. Ceremonial practice began to shape the structure of emerging societies. Even as these changes unfolded, the core of ceremonial thought remained rooted in the earliest insights of humankind. The belief that the world responded to intention, that symbols carried power, and that rhythmic action created harmony endured across thousands of years. What began as simple gestures in firelit clearings evolved into sophisticated systems capable of shaping entire civilizations. Yet, beneath the complexity, the fundamental purpose was the same: to bridge the gap between the human and the unknown. In these ancient origins, one can sense the first outlines of what would later become ceremonial magic. Not in the form of elaborate rituals, detailed grimoires, or philosophical doctrines, but in the quiet recognition that the universe was alive with patterns and that human beings could participate in those patterns. Every gesture, every mark, every sound became a way of touching the fabric of existence. Even the smallest action carried the possibility of influence and transformation. This early period left no written record, but its spirit echoes through all later traditions. When people painted symbols on cave walls, when they shaped tools with care, when they moved in circles around a fire, they were expressing an intuition that would guide humanity for millennia. Ritual was not merely a response to fear or a way to seek comfort. It was a declaration that the world was interconnected, that humans had agency, so then that meaning could be shaped through deliberate action. As the ages turned and the first civilizations began to form, these early intuitions would evolve into structured systems of ceremonial practice, carried forward by people who believed that the boundaries of the visible world could be crossed with the right combination of symbol, sound, and will. The earliest sparks of ceremonial magic had been lit, and in time they would illuminate entire cultures with their mysterious glow. As the earliest ceremonies grew into more deliberate structures, the first civilizations of the ancient world added new layers of meaning to humanity's attempts to reach the unseen. Mesopotamia, with its fertile plains and rising city-states, became one of the earliest landscapes in which ritual, politics, and cosmology intertwined. The people who lived between the Tigris and Euphrates believed that their cities were reflections of divine realms, built according to heavenly blueprints that mirrored constellations and sacred stories. Every temple, ziggurat, trod, and ceremonial chamber stood as a place where the boundaries between earth and sky thinned, allowing careful rituals to travel upward like smoke rising toward the heavens. Sumerian priests preserved intricate methods for communicating with gods whose names carried weight across centuries. Enlil, Inanna, Enki, and Nana were not distant abstractions, but living forces that shaped weather, fertility, and destiny. To maintain harmony between the divine and human realms, rituals were conducted daily with precise gestures and formulas. Even the slightest deviation was believed to risk imbalance. The careful recitation of hymns, the measured placement of offerings, and the cleansing of sacred spaces formed a cycle that guided the life of the city and upheld cosmic order. Incantations carved into clay tablets give a glimpse into the sophistication of these early ceremonial systems. These texts contain sequences of words that were believed to hold power, not because of their meanings, but because of their vibrations and ancient origins. A priest did not merely speak, he activated the presence of the divine through sound. When he shaped syllables that had been preserved for generations, he reenacted mythic events and aligned the present moment with primordial time. Each spoken line became a bridge between past and present, mortal and divine. In Mesopotamia, magic was not a separate practice hidden from society. It was embedded in temples, law, medicine, and governance. Divination played an especially important role to understand the will of the gods. Priests examined animal organs, read the movements of planets, or watched for unusual events in nature. A sudden eclipse or a strange birth in the animal world could shift the fate of a kingdom. Rituals were then performed to avert danger, strengthen protection, or guide leaders toward choices aligned with cosmic harmony. In this world, ceremonial practice was inseparable from the functioning of daily life. The cities expanded, so did their pantheons and rituals. Babylon became a center of astronomical magic, where temple scholars mapped the heavens with remarkable precision. They believed that every star was a divine writing, and that the movement of celestial bodies conveyed messages meant to be deciphered. Ritual calendars aligned with planetary cycles, and ceremonies were conducted to harmonize human intention with the rhythm of the sky. The priests who observed these patterns understood themselves as custodians of cosmic insight, responsible for maintaining order in a universe that was alive and responsive. Egypt, rising along the Nile with monumental temples and rich mythic traditions, carried ceremonial magic into an entirely different dimension. Here, ritual was woven into a worldview in which life, death, and rebirth formed a continuous cycle. The Egyptians believed that the cosmos was created through deliberate acts of speech and will. When the gods spoke the world into existence, they did so with intention, tone, and symbolic action. Human rituals mirrored these divine acts, allowing practitioners to participate in the same creative forces. Temple priests in Egypt lived by strict routines. They purified themselves each morning with water, donned garments that symbolized celestial order, and recited prayers that echoed the primal words spoken at the dawn of creation. Their actions were not meant to express personal devotion alone. They were thought to sustain the universe by reinforcing the patterns established by the gods. As they lit lamps, offered incense, or opened the shrine of a deity, they reenacted sacred dramas that renewed the world moment by moment. Hieroglyphs themselves formed a magical script. Each symbol was both an image and a living essence. When a scribe carved a hieroglyph into stone, he believed he was calling forth the presence of what the symbol represented. Writing was a sacred practice, and certain combinations of symbols served as powerful charms. Amulets inscribed with protective phrases were placed on the bodies of the living and the dead. These inscriptions were considered active tools that influenced destiny, guarded against illness, or ensured safe passage into the afterlife. The Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day, often called the Book of the Dead, is one of the earliest detailed manuals of ceremonial rites. It contains spells meant to guide the deceased through challenges on the journey beyond life. These spells were not simple prayers, but structured rituals with precise wording and timing. The journey of the soul was mapped with care, each stage requiring the right combination of speech, symbol, and intention. This reveals a profound belief in the transformative power of ritual, even in death. The correct sequence of actions could open gates, protect the traveler, and illuminate the path. Deities associated with magic, such as Thoth and Isis, played central roles in Egyptian ceremonial life. Thoth, the master of writing, wisdom, and sacred calculation, was believed to oversee the proper formulation of ritual. Isis, whose mythic actions included restoring the body of Osiris and conceiving Horus through powerful words and gestures, became a model for ceremonial practitioners. Her rituals were performed to invoke healing, protection, and resurrection. These myths shaped the understanding of ritual as a force capable not only of influencing its nature, but also of altering the structure of reality itself. The temples along the Nile were more than places of worship. They were centers of learning, astronomical observation, healing, and esoteric transmission. The layout of each temple mirrored the structure of the cosmos as understood through Egyptian myth. Moving from the outer courtyard toward the inner sanctuary was equivalent to moving from the visible world into the realm of the gods. Rituals performed along this path mapped out the same spiritual journey undertaken by souls in death, suggesting that ceremonial magic served as both cosmological reenactment and personal transformation. The Levant, situated between great civilizations, developed its own complex traditions that blended influences from surrounding cultures. In Canaanite and early Israelite societies, sacred names and divine presences held extraordinary importance. The idea that a name could hold power, or that speaking a name could invoke the essence of a deity, became deeply embedded in ritual practice. Altars were erected at high places, offerings were burned to establish connection, and sacred festivals followed agricultural cycles. Within these rites, the land itself was seen as alive with spiritual forces that required acknowledgement and negotiation. Among the peoples of the Levant, prophetic traditions emerged that linked ritual speech with altered states of consciousness. Prophets were believed to receive divine messages through visions, dreams, or ecstatic experiences. Their words carried immense weight and could shape political decisions, communal behavior, or moral law. Although prophetic practice differed from temple ritual, both relied on the belief that the unseen realm communicated through signs, voices, or emotional impressions. Ceremonial rites developed to interpret these experiences and integrate them into community life. As trade networks expanded, ideas flowed between Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Levantan cultures. Ritual structures began to share common features: sacred purification, invocations, offerings, protective charms, and symbolic alignment with celestial cycles. Yet each region preserved its distinctive worldview. Mesopotamian rites focused on maintaining cosmic order through continuous appeasement of deities. Egyptian rituals sought to reenact divine creation and sustain the cycle of life and death. Levantan practices emphasized relational dynamics between people and divine presence, expressed through names, speech, and covenant. In these ancient societies, ritual was a central thread woven through every aspect of existence. It structured time, marked transitions, honored ancestors, and guided both public and private life. A birth required omens and blessings to ensure the child would grow in harmony with divine forces. Marriage ceremonies forged connections not only between individuals, but also between families and spiritual guardians. Even building a home or planting a field involved rituals of protection and gratitude. These practices revealed a worldview in which human life was inseparable from the unseen. The development of priestly classes further refined ceremonial magic. Priests became custodians of ritual knowledge, inheriting techniques and formulas preserved through generations. Their training involved memorizing vast collections of hymns, incantations, and invocations. They learned to manipulate symbolic objects, calculate astronomical timings, and interpret omens with precision. As guardians of the sacred tradition, they shaped the evolution of ceremonial practice and ensured that rituals remained aligned with cosmic principles. The power of ritual in these early civilizations rested on the belief that symbols and actions reflected deeper truths about existence. A gesture performed in a temple was understood not as a mere physical act, but as a movement within the fabric of reality. Speaking a sacred phrase did not simply express devotion. It altered the resonance of the environment. Kiting incense activated unseen presences. Cooling water reenacted cosmic events connected to creation. Every aspect of ceremony had layers of meaning that connected the human realm to the divine. As mythologies expanded and deepened, ceremonial magic absorbed narrative elements that gave rituals both context and power. The story of a god overcoming chaos or descending into the underworld provided a template for rituals meant to banish misfortune or aid in spiritual ascent. The cycles of the Nile became metaphors for renewal and regeneration. The movement of planets reflected the journeys of divine beings. By participating in these mythic patterns, humans believed they were tapping into forces that shaped the universe. It is within this rich tapestry that the earliest forms of structured ceremonial magic took shape. Rituals ceased to be spontaneous and became codified, recorded, and transmitted through specialized texts. Temples stored collections of incantations, magical formulas, and ceremonial instructions that served as manuals for practitioners. The act of writing these texts elevated ritual from oral tradition to a field of study. The sacred became a subject of scholarly inquiry, and the priesthood became a class of ritual technicians as well as spiritual guides. Despite the grandeur of temples and the complexity of ceremonial systems, the personal dimension of ritual remained vital. Individuals visited shrines to seek healing, protection, or answers to their private questions, carried amulets inscribed with symbols to ward off illness or misfortune. They performed small household rites to honor ancestors or bless their families. In these intimate practices, the essence of ceremonial magic thrived as a means of shaping personal experience through symbolic action. As centuries passed, the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant faced periods of conquest, migration, and cultural change. Yet, the core ideas of their ceremonial magic endured. The belief in the power of sacred names, the significance of celestial cycles, and the transformative capacity of ritual action continued to influence later cultures. These ideas would eventually merge with philosophical developments in the Mediterranean world, giving rise to new forms of ritual that blended myth, science, and metaphysical speculation. Before such transformations unfolded, however, the ancient traditions had already laid an unshakable foundation. They had established the principle that the universe was structured, intelligible, and responsive. They had affirmed that human beings could align themselves with invisible forces through disciplined action. They had demonstrated that ritual could shape reality, whether through divine invocation, symbolic reenactment, or cosmic alignment. This structured worldview would soon encounter Greek thought, opening a new era in the evolution of ceremonial magic. In these early societies, the essence of ritual remained rooted in rhythm, meaning, and intention. The same impulses that moved prehistoric people to speak into the darkness now found expression in elaborate ceremonies along riverbanks and within towering temples. Magic had become not only a reflection of human desire, but a reflection of the universe itself through the earliest civilizations. Ceremonial magic began to articulate its purpose with clarity, to unite the human will with a deeper order of existence, and to reveal the invisible architecture of the world. As the civilizations of the Near East enriched the early structure of ceremonial practice, the intellectual world of the Greeks added a new dimension, the disciplined pursuit of understanding. In the lands surrounding the Aegean Sea, ritual, myth, and philosophy formed a dynamic triangle that shaped how people approached the unseen. Instead of accepting inherited cosmologies as fixed truths, Greek thinkers began to examine the workings of nature, the mind, and the divine with a curious and analytic spirit. This search for meaning did not oppose ritual. It transformed it, giving ceremonial magic a new foundation built upon reflection, symbolism, and personal transformation. Greek myth laid the groundwork for a worldview in which the gods were powerful yet accessible. Zeus commanded the sky, Poseidon shaped the seas, and Hades ruled the underworld. Yet these gods interacted with humans, answered petitions, and guided fates through omens and dreams. Festivals honored them with sacrifices, songs, and processions, each act reinforcing a relationship between mortals and the unseen. Rituals were performed not only in grand temples, but also in quiet household shrines where protective deities watched over daily life. Within this environment, ceremonial practice took on both public and private forms. The earliest Greek philosophers emerged from this cultural soil. They were not ritualists in the traditional sense, yet they sought the laws that governed existence, believing that understanding these laws opened a path to alignment with the divine. Thales spoke of the underlying unity of nature, suggesting that the visible world held hidden principles. Canamander described a boundless source from which all things emerged, into which they eventually returned. Canoclitus taught that reality moved through cycles of transformation, much like the rhythms found in ritual. These ideas encouraged later practitioners to view ceremony as a means of harmonizing with universal patterns. The Orphic tradition expanded the mystical dimension of Greek thought. Orphic initiates believed that the soul was divine and that earthly life was a temporary stage in a longer journey. Through purification, rituals, sacred hymns, and symbolic actions, they sought to awaken the soul's memory of its origin. Orphic texts describe a cosmology in which the universe was born from a luminous egg, shaped by divine music and rhythm. Rituals reflected this creation myth, using sound and movement to restore harmony within the practitioner. The Orphic emphasis on the soul's ascent deeply influenced later ceremonial magic, suggesting that ritual could elevate consciousness toward divine realms. Mystery traditions, especially those at Eleusis, introduced a structured form of sacred transformation that inspired countless practitioners across centuries. The Eleusinian mysteries centered on the myth of Demeter and Persephone, a story of loss, descent, and return. Initiates traveled from Athens to Eleusis in solemn procession, participating in rites that symbolized death and rebirth. Although the precise details of the ceremonies remained secret even after millennia, ancient writers described them as profoundly transformative. Those who emerged from the mysteries believed they had gained insight into the nature of life and death, carrying with them a sense of inner peace impossible to express in ordinary language. This emphasis on experiential transformation shaped the future of ceremonial magic. Instead of merely influencing external forces, ritual began to serve as a method for refining the self. Initiates learned to quiet the mind, open the senses, and perceive symbolic meaning in every gesture. They understood ritual as a journey inward, a process of discovering one's alignment with a greater cosmic order. Unlike public festivals, the mysteries required commitment, preparation, and moral purification. By entering sacred space with intention, participants believed they could touch the divine and awaken hidden capacities within themselves. Pythagoras pushed ritual and philosophy even further by linking them to mathematics and harmony. He taught that the universe was constructed from ratios and geometric principles, and that music reflected the numerical structure of creation. Ceremonial practices based on his teachings used sound, silence, and measured movement to attune the practitioner to cosmic harmony. The Pythagorean life involved daily exercises of reflection. Moral discipline and symbolic gestures meant to maintain balance. For Pythagoreans, ritual was not merely a set of actions, but a way of shaping the soul into a clear instrument capable of receiving divine insight. The mathematical aspect of Pythagorean philosophy introduced a new idea into ceremonial magic, that symbols could represent invisible truths. Numbers, shapes, and proportions became tools for understanding the hidden architecture of reality. The tetractys, a triangular arrangement of 10 points, embodied the principles of creation and order. Meditating on it was considered a form of ritual that harmonized the mind with the cosmos. This blending of abstract knowledge and ceremonial action would later influence Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Renaissance magic, weaving numeric symbolism into the fabric of esoteric practice. As Greek culture expanded through trade, colonization, and later the conquests of Alexander the Great, it encountered Egypt and Mesopotamia. The exchange of ideas that followed produced some of the most influential developments in the history of ceremonial magic. Greek travelers studied Egyptian temple rituals, observed the precision of astronomical calendars, and learned magical techniques preserved in papyri and oral traditions. They saw in Egyptian hieroglyphs a form of sacred writing, and in temple rites, a structured way of engaging with the divine. These encounters enriched Greek understanding of ritual, blending philosophical inquiry with ancient ceremonial wisdom. In the cosmopolitan environment of Alexandria, Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Near Eastern traditions mingled freely. The libraries, temples, and academies of this city became a crucible for esoteric thought. Scholars, priests, and seekers gathered to compare mythologies, discuss metaphysics, and experiment with new ritual forms. Greek philosophy offered frameworks for interpreting ancient symbols, while Egyptian and Mesopotamian practices provided techniques for invoking divine presence. The fusion of these traditions gave rise to a new worldview in which the magician became a mediator between earth and heaven, capable of influencing both through knowledge and will. The Hellenistic period saw the emergence of Hermetic philosophy, though its full expression would appear later. Early Hermetic thinkers viewed the universe as a living organism infused with divine intelligence. They believed that by studying nature and refining the mind, humans could attain wisdom and participate in the creative forces of the cosmos. Ritual, in this context, became a method of aligning individual consciousness with the divine source that permeated all things. This merging of intellectual and ceremonial traditions signaled a shift toward the idea that magic was a sacred science, grounded in observation and inner illumination. In addition to philosophical developments, the Greeks inherited and expanded practical magical techniques. Collections of spells, charms, and ritual instructions have survived in the form of the Greek magical papyri, a rich source of insight into ritual during the late Hellenistic and early Roman eras. These texts contain invocations to deities from multiple cultures, including Egyptian, Greek, and Jewish traditions. The rituals described involve sacred names, incense offerings, specific gestures, and visualization practices. They are evidence of a world in which ceremonial magic was both a personal and scholarly pursuit, bridging cultural boundaries with ease. Among these techniques, the use of sacred names held particular importance. Practitioners believed that uttering a divine name with the correct tone and intention could draw the presence of the corresponding deity or spirit. Some names were described as ancient words of power preserved through generations. Others were composite forms representing multiple divine attributes, emphasis on sound, vibration, and pronunciation, reflected a deep understanding of the psychological and symbolic effects of ritual speech. Through these practices, ceremonial magic became increasingly reliant on the disciplined use of language. The role of ecstatic experience also grew more refined in Greek tradition. The followers of Dionysus practiced rites that involved music, dance, and altered states of consciousness. These ceremonies were not chaotic expressions, but controlled methods for dissolving ordinary perception and accessing deeper layers of the psyche. Practitioners believed that in such states, they could communicate with divine forces, receive visions, or experience unity with nature. This approach to ritual would later influence the ecstatic aspects of theurgy and certain strands of mystical magic. Greek tragedy and theater added yet another layer to the evolution of ceremonial practice. Performances were originally part of religious festivals dedicated to Dionysus and other gods. Actors wore masks that represented archetypal forces, and the stage became a symbolic space where mythic events unfolded. The audience participated emotionally in these dramas, experiencing catharsis and spiritual awakening. This blending of narrative, symbolism, and collective experience contributed to the development of ritual as a transformative performance, shaping the inner life of participants through carefully orchestrated imagery. As intellectual inquiry deepened, Greek thinkers began to explore the nature of the soul. Plato described the soul as immortal and divine, trapped temporarily within the material body. He taught that the soul could ascend toward the realm of pure forms through contemplation, moral discipline, and philosophical insight. This concept influenced later rituals aimed at elevating consciousness toward higher realities. Cato's allegory of the cave, which depicts humanity is bound by illusions, became a metaphor for the ritual journey of awakening from ignorance to enlightenment. Aristotle, though more grounded in empirical observation, also contributed to the foundations of ceremonial thought. Its exploration of causation, the nature of the universe, and the forms of knowledge inspired later thinkers to view ritual as a method of engaging with different levels of reality. By defining the relationship between form and matter, actuality and potentiality, Aristotle offered a conceptual vocabulary that ceremonial practitioners would eventually use to describe their own processes of transformation and manifestation. The Stoics introduced a sense of cosmic order, governed by reason. They believed that the universe operated according to a divine logos, a rational principle that structured all events. To live in harmony with this logos was to live virtuously. Although the Stoics did not practice ceremonial magic, their belief in interconnectedness influenced later ritualists who sought to align their will with universal forces. The idea that the cosmos possessed a coherent structure reinforced the notion that ritual could tap into deeper patterns and harmonize the practitioner with fate. The blending of ritual and philosophy in Greek culture led to the development of practices that were both intellectually rigorous and symbolically rich. Some practitioners performed ceremonies involving visualization, meditation, sacred geometry, and the intentional cultivation of virtues. Others engaged in divination methods such as the observation of bird flight, the casting of lots, or the interpretation of dreams. These techniques were not mere superstitions, but structured methods for accessing information believed to arise from the deeper order of the cosmos. As Greek influence spread across the Mediterranean, these ideas encountered the rich traditions of Egypt and the Near East. Out of this counter emerged a hybrid form of ceremonial magic that elevated the role of the practitioner from supplicant to co-creator. Instead of simply petitioning the gods, magicians sought to enact divine power through knowledge, purification, and focused will. Ritual became a way of participating in the creative processes that shaped existence, reflecting a profound shift in humanity's understanding of its relationship to the unseen world. This era marked the transition from ritual as a communal obligation to ritual as a personal quest for transformation, knowledge, and alignment with cosmic forces. Whether through philosophical contemplation, mystery initiation, or symbolic ceremony, Greek practitioners sought to uncover the deeper truths hidden beneath the surface of myth and experience. Their contributions would form the intellectual and symbolic foundation for the next great era of ceremonial development. As the Hermetic tradition began to rise in the ancient world, the ideas forged in Greek culture did not vanish with time. They were preserved, adapted, and eventually woven into the fabric of later magical traditions. The emphasis on harmony, the belief in the soul's ascent, the power of sacred speech, and the significance of symbolic action would resonate through the centuries. As the Mediterranean world moved toward a new blend of cultures, these seeds began to sprout into a worldview where philosophy, ritual, and esoteric knowledge fused into a single coherent system. As the intellectual currents of Greece merged with the ancient ritual traditions of Egypt and the Near East, a new worldview began to form in the cosmopolitan heart of Alexandria. This city, with its libraries, temples, its bustling markets filled with travelers from countless lands, became the cradle of a philosophical and spiritual synthesis that would reshape ceremonial magic forever. Here, ideas did not simply coexist. They intertwined, forming a living tapestry of myth, science, ritual, and metaphysics. Within this vibrant environment, a new model of the magician emerged. One who did not merely petition the divine, but sought to understand and participate in the forces that shaped all existence. The atmosphere of Alexandria encouraged cross-cultural dialogue on an unprecedented scale. Greek scholars engaged with Egyptian priests in discussions about creation, cosmology, and the nature of the soul. Jewish mystics debated with philosophers about sacred language and the origin of the universe. Traditions, once separated by geography or language, now overlapped, creating fertile ground for new insights. Ritual practices that had once belonged to isolated temples or mystery cults were reinterpreted through philosophical frameworks that sought universal principles underlying diverse traditions. Out of this intellectual fusion grew the early forms of Hermeticism, tradition that would profoundly influence ceremonial magic for centuries to come. Although the Hermetic writings would be compiled later, their roots can be traced to this age of cultural mingling. The teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus presented the cosmos as a living and purposeful whole, imbued with divine intelligence. According to these teachings, the human being possessed a unique position in this cosmic order, capable of understanding the structure of reality through contemplation, study, and ritual engagement. The magician, in this view, became a microcosm of the universe, reflecting its patterns and participating in its creativity. One of the central themes of emerging Hermetic thought was the idea that knowledge itself was transformative. To understand the hidden laws of nature was to awaken powers dormant within the self. Ritual became not merely a set of actions intended to influence external forces, but a method of aligning the mind, body, and spirit with the deeper rhythms of existence. By contemplating symbols, performing precise gestures, or invoking divine names, the practitioner believed he or she could elevate consciousness and access realms ordinarily concealed from ordinary perception. The Hermetic emphasis on correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm laid the foundation for the symbolic systems that would later define ceremonial magic. If the universe was structured in a certain pattern, then the human mind could reproduce that pattern through meditation and ritual. This belief inspired the use of geometric forms, planetary associations, color symbolism, and sacred sequences of words, all intended to mirror cosmic principles. Rituals thus became carefully orchestrated events in which every element was chosen to reflect a deeper truth. Egyptian influences played a crucial role in shaping these ideas. The Egyptian belief that divine forces could be invoked through precise speech and symbolic action resonated strongly with Hermetic thinkers. Hieroglyphs, seen as living symbols, suggested that language could bridge the material and spiritual worlds. Temple rituals, with their focus on purification, sacred timing, and the handling of holy objects, demonstrated how disciplined action could align the practitioner with divine presence. These concepts blended seamlessly with Greek philosophical notions of of cosmic order and intellectual inquiry. The emerging Hermetic worldview also introduced a new interpretation of the role of the gods. Instead of distant beings ruling over human affairs, the gods were understood as intelligences or principles that permeated the structure of reality. It represented levels of consciousness, forces of nature, and stages of cosmic development. To interact with them through ritual was to engage directly with the building blocks of creation. This redefined magic as a sacred science grounded in metaphysical understanding rather than superstition or fear. As Hermetic ideas spread, a new class of practitioners began to appear, individuals who studied natural philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics alongside ritual techniques. They saw no division between scientific inquiry and spiritual practice. Observing the movement of the stars was both an intellectual exercise and a mystical one, revealing patterns that could be mirrored in ritual. Studying the properties of plants and minerals was a way of understanding the divine signatures embedded in the natural world. This integrated approach would later influence alchemy, astrology, and the complex correspondences of Renaissance magic. The Hermetic texts that survived from later centuries portray a universe that is at once mystical and orderly, a domain of hidden wisdom, accessible through disciplined thought. Rituals described in these texts emphasize purification, contemplation, and invocation. The practitioner prepares by quieting the senses, focusing the mind, and harmonizing the inner self with the rhythms of the cosmos. Only then does the ritual proceed, often involving visualization of divine forms, recitation of sacred phrases, and symbolic gestures intended to shape the inner world. The idea of ascent became central in Hermetic ceremonial practice. Through meditation and visionary ritual, the practitioner sought to rise through the layers of the cosmos, approaching ever higher forms of intelligence. This ascent was not merely symbolic, but believed to be an actual shift in consciousness. The practitioner experienced subtle realms, encountered luminous beings, and gained insights that transformed understanding. Such experiences were described in poetic metaphors, emphasizing the ineffable nature of the divine. This emphasis on ascent would later influence theurgy and the mystical branches of Neoplatonism. The blending of Greek and Egyptian traditions also produced new interpretations of divine names. Sacred names were considered keys that unlocked specific vibrations or states of awareness. Some names were inherited from ancient traditions, while others were constructed to reflect new metaphysical ideas. Practitioners believed that uttering these names with purity and precision allowed them to participate in the creative power of the divine. This practice built upon earlier traditions from the Near East, but framed them within a philosophical context that stressed the importance of intentionality. Meanwhile, Jewish mystical traditions developing in the same region contributed their own insights into ceremonial practice. The concept of a single divine source expressed through countless emanations influenced Hermetic ideas about divine hierarchy. The sacred importance of names and letters in Jewish tradition inspired new approaches to ritual language. Practitioners began to see words as instruments of creation, capable of shaping the inner landscape and connecting the soul to higher realms. This cross-pollination enriched ceremonial magic with layers of symbolic depth. Alchemy emerged as one of the most influential disciplines of this era, blending material experimentation with spiritual aspiration. Although alchemy is often remembered for its attempts to transform metals, its deeper purpose was the transformation of the practitioner. By studying the processes of dissolution, coagulation, and purification in the laboratory, alchemists believed they were witnessing the same processes occurring within the soul. Rituals associated with alchemy served to align these inner and outer transformations, reinforcing the belief that nature mirrored the spiritual journey. In alchemical symbolism, the union of opposites, the merging of sun and moon, sulfur and mercury, spirit and matter, represented the attainment of wholeness. When alchemists performed rituals involving heat, water, or carefully crafted vessels. They did so with the belief that these actions reflected movements within the psyche. Each stage of the alchemical work corresponded to a stage of inner refinement. This perspective expanded the scope of ceremonial magic by linking symbolic action with psychological transformation. Astrology, too, became integral to Hermetic ritual. Practitioners believed that celestial bodies influenced life on Earth, not through mechanical forces, but through symbolic resonance. Each planet embodied a divine principle, and its movement through the heavens reflected shifts in cosmic energies. Rituals were often timed according to planetary alignments to enhance their effectiveness. By aligning ritual actions with celestial rhythms, practitioners believed they were participating in the same harmony that governed the universe. This integration of philosophy, ritual, and symbolic science created a worldview in which the magician was both an observer and a participant in cosmic processes. To practice ceremonial magic in this era was to step into a lineage of ancient traditions, reinterpreted through intellectual insight. The magician was expected to cultivate purity of mind, moral discipline, and profound understanding. Ritual was not a matter of superstition, but an exercise in alignment, intention, and spiritual clarity. As Hermetic ideas spread beyond Alexandria, they influenced a wide range of practitioners across the Mediterranean world. Some integrated Hermetic practices into existing religious traditions, while others formed small groups dedicated to the study of esoteric wisdom. These communities transmitted ritual techniques, philosophical insights, and symbolic systems that would survive long after the fall of the ancient world. Even as political structures shifted and empires rose and fell, the seeds planted by Alexandrian synthesis continued to grow. The Roman Empire, with its vast territory and diverse populations, became an environment where Hermetic ideas could flourish. Roman intellectuals were intrigued by the promise of accessing divine wisdom through structured practice. Temples and private households alike hosted rituals inspired by Hermetic principles. Practitioners combined Roman religious traditions with Greek philosophy and Egyptian symbolism, creating ceremonies that blended cultural elements into coherent systems. This adaptability ensured that ceremonial magic continued to evolve as it encountered new contexts. The emerging concept of theurgy, or divine work, took shape in this era. Theurgy emphasized rituals intended not merely to influence external events, but to elevate the soul toward divine union. Practitioners believed that through carefully constructed ceremonies, they could invoke divine powers and ascend through layers of spiritual reality. It's a part of Hermetic principles, but placed greater emphasis on ritual experience and direct engagement with divine presences. This shift deepened the role of ceremonial magic as a path of spiritual ascent. Liturgical rituals often involved visualization, sacred gestures, and the invocation of divine names. Practitioners described encounters with luminous beings, visions of cosmic harmony, or moments of overwhelming clarity. These experiences were interpreted as signs of divine favor or evidence that the soul had reached a higher state. Liturgic practice required discipline, preparation, and purity. It was not accessible to everyone, but reserved for those willing to dedicate themselves fully to the pursuit of spiritual transformation. As the idea of the magician evolved, so did the tools used in ritual. Objects such as wands, rings, statues, and inscribed tablets became important components of ceremonial practice. These tools were not merely symbolic. They were considered vessels for divine power or instruments that directed subtle energies. The choice of materials, shapes, and inscriptions reflected the practitioner's understanding of cosmic correspondences. Ritual tools thus became a physical expression of metaphysical insight. The concept of initiation also grew in importance. Initiation was not simply an introduction to ritual techniques, but a transformative event intended to open the practitioner to higher realities through symbolic death and rebirth, purification. In the transmission of sacred knowledge, initiates entered a lineage of practitioners connected by shared understanding. This process reinforced the idea that ceremonial magic was a disciplined path requiring commitment, study, and personal refinement. By the time the Roman Empire reached its height, ceremonial magic had become a rich tapestry of traditions woven together through centuries of cultural interaction. Greek philosophy provided the intellectual structure. Egyptian rituals offered symbolic depth. Jewish mysticism contributed sacred language, and Near Eastern practices preserved ancient techniques of invocation and divination. Together, these influences formed the Hermetic worldview that would guide generations of practitioners beyond the fall of antiquity. The foundations laid in this era would prove resilient. Even as the ancient world moved toward its twilight, the core insights of Hermetic practice endured, that the universe was alive with meaning, that symbols could reveal hidden truths, and that ritual could elevate the soul toward divine wisdom. These ideas would soon enter a new phase of development as the Roman world transformed and the philosophers of late antiquity turned their attention to the nature of divine presence. As the Roman world expanded across continents, the landscape of ritual practice shifted once again. At its height, the empire connected distant cultures under a single political framework, allowing ideas to flow with remarkable freedom. Temples from Britain to Syria echoed with hymns in different languages, each honoring local gods while sharing architectural forms and ceremonial structures. Roman religion itself was practical, civic, and deeply intertwined with the functioning of the state. Yet, beneath this public layer, quieter world of private ritual and hidden knowledge continued to develop, shaped by the currents of Hermetic thought that had begun to influence the empire's intellectual circles. Roman religious life centered on maintaining harmony between the community and the gods. Ceremonies were performed to protect the city, bless the harvest, or secure the favor of divine guardians. These rituals involved offerings, libations, and prayers recited with strict precision. Every gesture mattered. Officials responsible for ritual were expected to learn the correct formulas through long experience. A single mistake could render a ceremony invalid, requiring the entire process to begin again. This insistence on accuracy reflected an understanding that ritual worked through alignment with divine order, a theme consistent with earlier ceremonial traditions. While state rituals emphasized public duty, private practices offered individuals a more personal relationship with the unseen. Domestic shrines housed images of household gods who protected the family. Daily offerings of wine, bread, or incense were made to these guardians, reinforcing the idea that ritual was woven into the rhythm of life. Travelers carried small charms to ensure safe passage. Soldiers offered prayers for victory, and merchants invoked divine favor before undertaking new ventures. These everyday practices preserved ancient methods of ritual engagement, even as formal religious structures became more elaborate. One of the most revealing aspects of Roman ritual life was the use of curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with names and desired outcomes. These tablets, often buried in wells or placed in tombs, were intended to petition divine forces to influence human affairs. Some called for justice against thieves or wrongdoers, while others sought to sway the outcome of competitions or romantic pursuits. The act of inscribing a tablet followed a recognizable pattern. The practitioner wrote the target's name, stated the request, invoked a deity or spirit, and sealed the intention with binding words, These formulas reveal a belief that precise language held power to shape events, a concept inherited from earlier magical traditions. The Roman world also embraced foreign cults, many of which brought new forms of ritual into the empire. The cult of Isis from Egypt attracted followers seeking personal salvation and mystical experience. Initiates participated in ceremonies that symbolically reenacted the death and resurrection of Osiris, reflecting themes of renewal and transformation. The worship of Mithras, popular among soldiers, involved complex initiation rites held in underground chambers designed to evoke cosmic symbolism. These mystery traditions offered participants a sense of belonging and spiritual depth that extended beyond the formal structures of state religion. Philosophical schools played a significant role in shaping the evolution of ceremonial magic during the Roman era. Stoicism emphasized living in harmony with the divine logos that governed the universe, encouraging practitioners to cultivate inner discipline and emotional balance. Epicureanism promoted understanding the natural world through rational inquiry, though it tended to reject ritual in favor of calm detachment. Meanwhile, Platonism and Pythagoreanism continued to inspire those who sought deeper insights into the nature of the soul and its relationship to the cosmos. These schools provided intellectual frameworks that practitioners could apply to ritual, grounding ceremonial actions in metaphysical theory. As these ideas intermingled, a new vision of magic began to emerge. Instead of viewing ritual as a means of manipulating external forces, some thinkers saw it as a method for elevating consciousness. This perspective grew more pronounced as Neoplatonism gained prominence in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Neoplatonists believed that reality consisted of multiple layers, each emanating from a single divine source. The material world was the most distant expression of this source, while higher realms contained ever purer forms of consciousness. The human soul, according to this philosophy, originated from these higher realms and could return to them through spiritual discipline. This framework profoundly shaped ceremonial practice. Ritual became a method for guiding the soul upward, invoking divine intelligences that governed the intermediate realms. Practitioners believed that through symbolic gestures, sacred words, and meditative focus, they could open themselves to the presence of these higher powers. Neoplatonic thinkers described this process with clarity, emphasizing the need for purification, moral integrity, and philosophical understanding. Ritual was no longer a matter of mere tradition, but a carefully crafted journey toward divine union. One of the most influential proponents of this approach was the philosopher Iamblichus. He argued that ritual, or theurgy, was essential for spiritual ascent. According to Iamblichus, human intellect alone could not reach the divine. Ritual action was required to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal realms. Theurgy involved invoking divine beings through symbols believed to resonate with their essence. These symbols were not arbitrary, but reflected correspondences embedded in the structure of the cosmos. By aligning himself with these symbols, the practitioner harmonized his soul with higher realities. Iamblichus described theurgical rituals as transformative encounters. The practitioner purified the space through incense and gesture, focused the mind through contemplation, and invoked divine power through sacred formulas. When the ritual succeeded, a presence descended, filling the space with luminous awareness. This encounter elevated the soul, granting insight and serenity. Theurgical practice thus formalized the idea that ritual could create a bridge between the human and the divine, an idea that would resonate throughout later ceremonial traditions. Proclus, another prominent Neoplatonist, expanded upon these ideas. He emphasized the role of imagination in ritual, describing it as a faculty capable of perceiving symbolic truths. According to Proclus, the images used in ritual were not mere representations, but pathways to divine realities. When a practitioner visualized a god or celestial sphere, he aligned his consciousness with that realm. This perspective redefined the purpose of ritual imagery, transforming it into an instrument of ascent. The role of divine names continued to evolve during this period. Names were understood as expressions of divine power, each carrying a unique vibration. Practitioners believed that through correct pronunciation and inner alignment, they could call forth the presence of a god or daemon. Some names were associated with specific heavenly spheres, while others represented universal principles. The emphasis on correct intonation reflected a deep understanding of the psychological and symbolic impact of sound. For the theurgist, spoken language became a ladder reaching toward the divine. Late antiquity also saw the development of ritual manuals that preserved detailed instructions for ceremonies. These texts contained sequences of invocations, descriptions of sacred objects, and diagrams of symbolic layouts. Okay? While some rituals drew upon traditional mythologies, others synthesized elements from multiple cultures. A ceremony might invoke Greek gods, Egyptian deities, and abstract divine intelligences in a single rite. This fusion did not reflect confusion, but a belief that all spiritual traditions pointed toward the same ultimate reality. Each symbol, regardless of its cultural origin, expressed a facet of the universal order. The popularity of these rituals increased as the Roman Empire faced political instability. People sought solace in practices that offered meaning beyond the material world. Mystery cults, Hermetic groups, and philosophical circles flourished, providing methods for navigating a time of uncertainty. Ritual became a source of inner strength, offering practitioners a sense of continuity and purpose. Even as external structures weakened, the inner architecture of ceremonial magic grew stronger, sustained by centuries of accumulated wisdom. During this period, the concept of personal daimon emerged as a significant aspect of ritual practice. A daimon was understood not as a malevolent being, but as an intermediary spirit that guided the individual. Philosophers such as Socrates had already spoken of an inner voice or guardian presence, and later thinkers expanded this idea into a structured belief. Practitioners sought to establish conscious communication with their daimon through ritual, believing that it offered guidance, insight, and protection. This relationship was seen as essential for spiritual progress, linking the human soul to higher realms while grounding it in daily life. As Christianity began to spread through the empire, tensions emerged between traditional rituals and new religious ideals. Many early Christian thinkers viewed ceremonial magic with suspicion, associating it with idolatry or dangerous spirits. Yet, despite these tensions, elements of earlier rituals persisted. Christian liturgy developed in an environment that had long valued symbolic action, sacred language, and structured ceremony. Incense, chanting, sacred architecture, and ritual gestures were adapted to new theological meanings. The continuity of these practices demonstrates how deeply ritual was embedded in the fabric of life. Even as older traditions faced opposition, the influence of Neoplatonism continued. Christian mystics drew upon Neoplatonic ideas of ascent, divine light, and inner purification. Some adapted these concepts into contemplative practices, seeking direct experience of the divine through prayer and meditation. Although doctrinal differences existed, a shared belief in the soul's potential for transcendence created unexpected bridges between ceremonial magic and emerging forms of spirituality. By the end of antiquity, the Roman world had transformed profoundly. Empires shifted, religions rose and declined, and social structures evolved. Yet the ceremonial practices developed during this era did not disappear. They were preserved in hidden circles, encoded in manuscripts, and transmitted through monastic communities, alchemical traditions, and scholarly networks. The rituals of late antiquity contained the seeds of future magic, awaiting revival when the world was ready to hear their voices again. These preserved ideas would lay dormant for centuries before flowering once more in medieval and Renaissance Europe. The symbolic correspondences, philosophical insights, and ceremonial techniques refined during the Roman era formed the foundation upon which later practitioners would build. When the texts of antiquity resurfaced, they would ignite a new age of magical exploration, guided by the same principles of order, alignment, and divine communion that had shaped the earliest temples and mystery rites. The journey of ceremonial magic through the Roman world demonstrates how resilient and adaptive ritual practices can be. Despite shifting cultural landscapes, the core idea endured. Human beings possess the ability to enter into conscious relationship with the unseen forces that shape existence. Through disciplined action, symbolic engagement, and inner refinement, the practitioner can awaken the soul to its true nature. The legacy of this era would travel across millennia, guiding future seekers toward the same ancient goal of harmony with the divine. When the ancient world gave way to the early medieval era, ceremonial magic did not disappear. Instead, it shifted its shape, retreating from public temples into more concealed spaces where monks, scholars, and wandering practitioners preserved fragments of older wisdom. The fall of the Roman Empire fractured cultural networks that had once carried philosophical, and ritual knowledge across vast territories. Roads decayed, libraries burned, and centers of learning diminished, yet ideas rarely vanish. They transform, sometimes quietly, sometimes through subtle adaptation. In this transitional period, ceremonial magic survived not through temples of stone, but through manuscripts copied by hand, whispered traditions, and the resilient human desire to understand the unseen. Christianity had become the dominant spiritual framework across much of Europe. Its worldview, centered on a single divine source, reshaped how people approached ritual and the sacred. Yet the Church inherited a world steeped in symbolic ceremony, sacred calendars, purified spaces, and the belief that divine presence could be invoked through words and gestures. Christian liturgy drew upon older ritual structures, even as it reinterpreted them, blending inherited traditions with new theological meaning. Scents, chanting, vestments, processions, and sacred architecture all reflected ceremonial patterns that had evolved for millennia. While the Church emphasized obedience to divine authority, it could not entirely suppress the older impulse to engage with the unseen through symbolic action. Many rural communities continued to practice agricultural rites, seasonal festivals, and protective charms. These traditions were often reinterpreted as cultural customs rather than expressions of pagan religion, allowing them to survive beneath the surface of official doctrine. In some cases, Christian saints replaced older gods in the popular imagination, serving similar roles as protectors of crops, healers, or guardians of travelers. Ritual continuity thus persisted under new names and within new frameworks. Monasteries became unexpected guardians of esoteric knowledge. Monks who copied manuscripts did so with great care, often preserving texts that contained fragments of ancient philosophy, medicine, astrology, and magical instruction. Although some works were censored or annotated with warnings, others survived intact because they were valued for their intellectual merit. The process of copying a manuscript was itself a ritual of preservation, an act that carried knowledge across centuries. Within the quiet walls of scriptoria, ideas that had once animated temples and philosophical schools found refuge. Among the texts preserved in this way were works of late antiquity that discussed angelic hierarchies, celestial spheres, and symbolic correspondences. These writings influenced the development of medieval cosmology, providing a bridge between Christian theology and the philosophical traditions of earlier ages. The concept of a structured universe with multiple levels of existence aligned well with Christian views of heaven, earth, and the spiritual realms. As a result, certain elements of ceremonial magic found new life within religious scholarship. One of the most influential figures of this era was Pseudo-Dionysius, a mysterious author whose works merged Christian theology with Neoplatonic concepts. He described a vast hierarchy of angelic beings, each with distinct roles and symbolic attributes. His writings portrayed the universe as a chain of illumination flowing from the divine source through intermediate beings to the human soul. This structure resonated with earlier esoteric systems, though it was framed within Christian doctrine. Ritual, in this context, became a way of aligning oneself with the celestial hierarchy, not through direct invocation, but through prayer, contemplation, and symbolic purity. As these ideas spread, they shaped the spiritual imagination of medieval Europe. Its belief in angels as intermediaries between the divine and human realms encouraged practices that resembled older forms of ritual engagement. People prayed to specific angels for protection, guidance, or healing. Sacred objects, such as relics or blessed items, were believed to carry divine power. Churches were oriented according to celestial symbolism, reinforcing the connection between earthly structures and heavenly order. Although not called magic, these practices reflected the same understanding of symbolic resonance that had guided ceremonial traditions for centuries. Astrology also played a significant role in medieval life. Despite periodic condemnation by religious authorities, astrology was widely studied and respected as a science of divine signs. Scholars believed that the movements of the planets reflected God's will, providing insight into the nature of events and the patterns of time. Astrological charts guided decisions ranging from agricultural planning to political strategy. Physicians used planetary correspondences to diagnose illness and choose appropriate treatments. This integration of astrology into daily life kept alive the belief that celestial and earthly realms were interconnected. Alchemy, too, flourished during this period, blending practical experimentation with spiritual symbolism. Medieval alchemists inherited texts from Arabic scholars who had preserved and expanded upon earlier Hermetic traditions. These works describe the transformation of metals as a reflection of the soul's journey toward illumination. Although alchemists worked in laboratories, their processes were infused with ritual meaning. They believed that the materials they handled responded to the purity of their intention and the clarity of their understanding. The quest for the philosopher's stone symbolized not only material transmutation, but also the achievement of inner wholeness. Some alchemical manuscripts contain diagrams of furnaces shaped like cosmic symbols, instructions for timing operations according to planetary hours, and invocations to spiritual forces believed to guide the work. These practices echoed the earlier belief that ritual alignment with cosmic order was essential for achieving transformation, even when cloaked in the language of natural philosophy. Alchemy preserved ceremonial magic's emphasis on correspondences, intention, and symbolic structure. Throughout the early medieval period, magical texts circulated quietly, often copied into collections that blended medical recipes, prayers, and esoteric instructions. These manuscripts, known as grimoires, contained spells for protection, healing, divination, and other practical purposes. Although their origins were diverse, many drew upon ancient traditions of invocation and symbolic action. They often included lists of divine names, diagrams of protective circles, and instructions for consecrating ritual tools. The survival of such texts demonstrates how deeply ceremonial thought had embedded itself within the culture, finding ways to persist even under religious scrutiny. One of the most intriguing aspects of this period is the coexistence of official doctrine and unofficial practice. While church authorities condemned certain forms of ritual, they tolerated others that did not challenge theological boundaries. This created a space in which ceremonial magic could survive in disguised or adapted forms. A charm invoking an angel for protection might be considered acceptable, while one invoking an earlier deity would be condemned. Practitioners learned to veil their rituals in language that aligned with Christian belief, allowing older techniques to continue under new disguises. The concept of sacred language evolved in this context as well. Latin, the language of the church and scholarship, acquired a powerful aura. Its use in prayers, blessings, and ritual formulas reinforced the belief that certain words carried divine resonance. Some magical texts relied on Latin phrases, blending them with older names drawn from Hebrew, Greek, or unknown origins. This mixture reflected the belief that sacred words from multiple traditions could enhance the potency of a ritual, echoing the syncretic tendencies of late antiquity. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, a remarkable intellectual flourishing preserved and expanded earlier esoteric traditions. Arabic scholars translated Greek and Egyptian works, adding their own insights into astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. They developed sophisticated systems of planetary magic, talismanic art, and astral ritual. These traditions would eventually make their way back into Europe through Spain, influencing the next phase of ceremonial development. The seeds planted in the medieval period would bloom in the Renaissance, when European scholars regained access to the ancient texts that had shaped the early world. Yet, even before that renewal, a quiet undercurrent of ceremonial thought persisted. Hermits and mystics retreated into remote landscapes to pursue solitary contemplation. Some practiced forms of meditation that resembled earlier techniques of inner ascent. Others described visions of celestial beings or luminous truths that echoed Neoplatonic experiences. These individuals, although often working within a Christian framework, contributed to the preservation of inner techniques that would later re-emerge in more explicit ritual forms. The medieval fascination with relics and sacred objects also reflected an unbroken thread of ceremonial logic. A relic was believed to carry the spiritual presence of a saint, much as a statue or talisman had once carried the presence of a god. Pilgrims traveled great distances to touch or view these objects, believing that physical proximity could bring healing or protection. This concept mirrored the earlier belief in the power of consecrated objects, demonstrating that the essence of ceremonial thought remained alive beneath new theological structures. Medieval architecture further preserved ceremonial symbolism. Cathedrals were designed with mathematical precision, incorporating sacred geometry that reflected cosmic principles. The shape of a rose window, the ratio of the nave, the alignment of the building with the sunrise on feast days, all of these choices were infused with symbolic meaning. Entering such a cathedral was a ritual in itself, echoing the movement from the outer courtyard of an Egyptian temple toward the inner sanctum. Light streaming through stained glass created an atmosphere that evoked the presence of the divine, shaping the inner experience of the visitor. Even the structure of monastic life carried ceremonial echoes. Daily cycles of prayer, fasting, meditation, and labor followed a rhythm that mirrored cosmic patterns. The hours of the day were marked with ritual precision, reinforcing the idea that human life should align with divine order. This disciplined structure preserved the ancient belief that ritual timing mattered, that the alignment of inner and outer rhythms strengthened the soul's connection to the unseen. In time, the medieval world would lay the groundwork for a profound transformation. As trade routes reopened, as learning revived in European cities, and as ancient manuscripts resurfaced, ceremonial magic would enter a new stage of development. The ideas preserved in monasteries, hidden in grimoires, or whispered in rural traditions would return to the forefront of intellectual life. Scholars would rediscover Hermetic writings, Neoplatonic philosophy, and Arabic magical treatises. Artists, philosophers, practitioners would weave these insights into elaborate systems that shaped the golden age of Renaissance magic. The early medieval era was thus not a period of decline, but one of gestation. Ritual knowledge survived in altered forms, preserved through devotion, scholarship, and cultural memory. The belief that symbols mattered, that divine forces responded to intention, and that ritual could shape the soul's journey endured despite the shifting political and religious landscape. This persistence ensured that when the time came for ceremonial magic to flourish once more, it would rise with richness shaped by centuries of quiet preservation. As the medieval world approached its horizon, the foundations for future ceremonial systems were firmly in place. The next era would witness a renewal of ancient wisdom, a reawakening of the philosophical and ritual traditions that had once shaped temples, mysteries, and scholarly circles. The medieval guardians of esoteric knowledge had kept the flame alive, and soon that flame would blaze again in the hands of those who sought to bridge the realms of matter and spirit. As the medieval world grew more interconnected through trade, scholarship, and cultural exchange, the survival of ancient knowledge began to reveal itself in new forms. The monasteries that had once preserved fragments of ritual wisdom continued their work, but now they coexisted with emerging centers of learning in cities such as Paris, Toledo, Bologna, and Oxford. In these growing intellectual communities, scholars sought to reconcile faith with reason, theology with philosophy, and tradition with discovery. This atmosphere set the stage for a quiet revival of ceremonial ideas filtered through the lens of Christian theology, yet still carrying echoes of earlier ages. The translation movement was one of the most transformative forces of this era. Across Europe, Scholars encountered a flood of texts arriving from the Islamic world, where Greek, Persian, and Egyptian knowledge had been preserved, studied, and expanded. Works on astrology, alchemy, mathematics, and medicine re-entered Europe through Spain and Sicily, carried by translators who understood both Latin and Arabic. These manuscripts did not simply restore lost knowledge, they introduced entirely new systems of symbolic thought, the rediscovery of Aristotle, the writings of Galen, and the works of Neoplatonic commentators revived intellectual traditions that had been dormant for centuries. Among these texts were treatises on talismanic art, astral ritual, and the properties of divine names. Scholars encountered diagrams depicting celestial hierarchies, instructions for consecrating objects, and tables mapping correspondences between planets, metals, and spiritual influences. Although many of these works were couched in a language of natural philosophy, their symbolic depth revealed their roots in older ritual traditions. The line between scholarly study and ceremonial practice grew increasingly thin as scholars sought to understand the deeper principles behind these ancient arts. The school of translators in Toledo played a crucial role in this revival. Here, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, translating texts that bridged cultural and religious boundaries. Among these were works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, whose name had become a symbol of ancient wisdom, although the full corpus of Hermetic writings would not emerge until later. Fragments circulated widely, inspiring interest in the idea that a hidden spiritual science lay behind the workings of nature. This curiosity paved the way for the Renaissance rediscovery of Hermetic philosophy, which would reshape ceremonial magic in dramatic ways. In the universities of medieval Europe, philosophers debated the relationship between spiritual forces and the natural world. Thomas Aquinas, though committed to orthodox theology, acknowledged the influence of celestial bodies on earthly events. He described angels as beings who governed the motions of the heavens and shaped the order of creation. His synthesis of Christian doctrine with Aristotelian cosmology reinforced the idea of a universe structured according to layered hierarchies, although he condemned certain forms of ritual invocation. His cosmology inadvertently provided a framework for understanding celestial correspondences, echoing older ceremonial systems. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar with a deep interest in natural philosophy, explored the boundaries between permissible knowledge and forbidden arts. He studied optics, mathematics, alchemical processes, and astral influences. In his writings, he spoke of hidden forces that permeated the world, forces that could be understood through disciplined inquiry. Although careful to remain within theological limits, he hinted at the possibility of influencing natural processes through symbolic action. Fearing misinterpretation, he warned that such knowledge required moral integrity and deep understanding. His caution reflected the tension of the era as scholars navigated the boundary between legitimate study and condemned practices. Alchemy continued to evolve, carrying ceremonial meaning even when framed as physical experimentation. Alchemists described their laboratories as microcosms of the universe, their furnaces as miniature suns, and their processes as reflections of cosmic cycles. Ritual purity remained essential. The alchemist prepared not only his materials, but also his mind and soul. Instructions often included prayers, invocations, and symbolic diagrams intended to guide both inner and outer transformation. These texts reinforced the belief that the material and spiritual worlds were intertwined, a belief central to ceremonial magic. One influential work from this era was the Picatrix, a massive compendium of astral magic translated from Arabic sources. The text described how images could be created under specific planetary configurations to capture celestial forces. These talismans, once consecrated through ritual, were believed to influence events, emotions, or natural phenomena. The Picatrix combined philosophical reasoning with practical instruction, offering a system that connected celestial cycles, symbolic images, and ritual action. Although controversial, It shaped the imagination of many scholars and practitioners who sought to understand the hidden powers of the universe. In rural communities, older traditions continued to flourish, often blending with Christian symbolism. Practitioners used herbs, spoken charms, and simple rituals to protect livestock, heal illness, or bless crops. These customs were rooted in ancient practices of sympathetic magic, though now clothed in the language of saints and scripture. The concept of certain days being more powerful for ritual persisted, as did beliefs in sacred objects and protective spaces. These practices preserved a worldview in which humans could influence their surroundings through intention and symbolic action. Folkloric traditions also contributed to the evolution of medieval magic. Tales of wise women, cunning men, and wandering healers reflected a widespread belief in individuals who possessed special knowledge of the unseen. Some used herbs, others invoked angels, and still others claimed visions or dreams that guided their work. While not formal ceremonial magicians, they preserved fragments of older wisdom carried through centuries of oral tradition. Their rituals, though simple, often mirrored the structure of more elaborate ceremonial practices. Within the church itself, mystical movements arose that emphasized direct experience of the divine. Visionary mystics described encounters with angels, luminous presences, and realms of radiant beauty. They used symbolic language to describe inner journeys that resembled earlier forms of ritual ascent. Although framed within Christian theology, their experiences echoed the Neoplatonic ascent of the soul. They spoke of stages of purification, illumination, and union, reflecting a spiritual pathway not unlike the initiatory structures of earlier ceremonial traditions. The rise of the mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans, also contributed to the preservation of ritual knowledge. These orders emphasized study, contemplation, and engagement with the natural world. Their members wrote treatises on cosmology, metaphysics, and the nature of spiritual beings. Some explored the symbolic meaning of numbers, the geometry of sacred architecture, and the relationship between earthly forms and divine principles. These studies subtly reinforced the ceremonial worldview that saw the world as a network of correspondences. As the medieval world matured, libraries expanded and the availability of texts increased. Scholars became more aware of the vast range of knowledge preserved in earlier eras. The realization that ancient civilizations had explored symbolic systems, celestial cycles, and ritual techniques ignited a growing fascination with esoteric wisdom. Although access to these works remained limited, the seeds had been planted for a revival that would blossom fully during the Renaissance. The late medieval period also saw the emergence of more complex grimoires, manuals that contained ritual instructions, invocations, and diagrams. These texts blended Christian, Jewish, and older esoteric elements, reflecting the diverse influences that shaped ceremonial practice. Some grimoires listed angelic hierarchies and divine names used for invoking assistance or protection. Others included seals, sigils, and ritual sequences intended to communicate with spiritual beings. The inclusion of prayers alongside magical formulas illustrated the fluid boundaries between sanctioned and forbidden practices. The belief in the efficacy of sacred names remained strong. Practitioners invoked the names of God, angels, and biblical figures to bless objects, heal illness, or protect against harm. These invocations reflected the older idea that speaking a sacred name aligned the practitioner with divine power. Even when framed as prayer, this practice preserved the ceremonial logic that connected sound, intention, and spiritual influence. The development of ritual magic in the medieval era was not uniform. In some regions, fear of witchcraft led to heightened suspicion of any form of unusual ritual. In others, intellectual curiosity created space for experimentation and exploration. This diversity of experience allowed ceremonial knowledge to survive in multiple forms, each shaped by local culture, religion, and historical circumstance. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was poised for transformation. the revival of classical learning, the growth of universities, and the expansion of trade created an environment in which old ideas could be rediscovered and reinterpreted. Deity. The invention of the printing press would soon make texts more accessible than ever before, breaking down barriers that had kept knowledge confined to elite circles. In this shifting landscape, ceremonial magic would undergo one of its most dramatic evolutions. The medieval period had preserved the symbolic language, ritual structures, and esoteric concepts that formed the backbone of ceremonial magic. Although often hidden beneath layers of theology, folklore, and scholarly caution, these elements remained intact. When the Renaissance dawned, practitioners would draw upon this preserved legacy to create new systems that combined intellectual rigor with ritual depth. The medieval guardians of knowledge had kept alive the essential principles of divine correspondence, symbolic action, and ritual assent. Their work ensured that ceremonial magic would not only survive, but flourish in the centuries to come. As the horizon of the medieval world brightened with the promise of renewal, the seeds of ancient wisdom waited patiently. The next age would bring scholars, artists, and visionaries who would breathe new life into the texts of antiquity. They would rediscover the Hermetic writings, reinterpret Platonic philosophy, and develop intricate systems of ritual practice that blended science, symbolism, and spiritual insight. The foundation laid by medieval thinkers would become the platform for a flowering of ceremonial magic, unmatched since the mysteries of old. When the Renaissance unfurled across Europe, it brought with it a profound shift in how humanity understood itself, nature, and the cosmos. The rediscovery of classical texts, the flourishing of art, and the revival of philosophical inquiry all combined to create an atmosphere ripe for transformation. Scholars sought not only to imitate antiquity, but to revive its spirit in a more refined and expansive form. In this environment, ceremonial magic experienced one of its most extraordinary rebirths. Ideas that had lain dormant for centuries suddenly surged into prominence. Illuminated by newly uncovered manuscripts and interpreted through the fresh lens of Renaissance humanism, the intellectual heart of this revival lay in the recovery of the Hermetic writings. Translated into Latin in the mid-15th century, the Corpus Hermeticum stunned European scholars with its blend of mystical insight, philosophical clarity, and cosmic vision. The text presented a universe filled with divine intelligence, governed by principles that linked all levels of existence. Humans were portrayed as beings capable of extraordinary understanding, able to ascend through the layers of the cosmos through contemplation and ritual. The idea that humanity could know and participate in divine creation resonated deeply with Renaissance thinkers who were already challenging medieval limitations on human potential. Marsilio Ficino, a Florentine priest and philosopher, became one of the central figures in this revival. Under the patronage of the Medici family, he translated the Hermetic writings as well as the works of Plato and Plotinus. Ficino believed that philosophy, theology, and magic were not separate domains, but branches of a single pursuit, the alignment of the human soul with divine harmony. He developed a system of spiritual practices that involved music, prayer, meditation, and the invocation of planetary influences. According to Ficino, each planet embodied a particular quality of the divine mind, and by attuning oneself to these celestial forces, one could refine the soul and restore its natural balance. Ficino's magic was gentle and contemplative, a fusion of prayer and philosophical reflection. He saw no contradiction between Christian faith and Hermetic wisdom, believing that both pointed toward the same divine source. His emphasis on harmony and resonance echoed the Pythagorean belief that the universe was structured according to mathematical and musical ratios. Ritual, in this context, became a method of tuning the soul to cosmic frequencies. These ideas would profoundly influence later practitioners who expanded Ficino's insights into more elaborate ceremonial structures. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, another towering figure of the Renaissance, carried the revival of esoteric thought into new territories. Pico sought to unify all wisdom traditions, Grecian, Jewish, Greek, Persian, and Mauryan, to a single, coherent system of spiritual truth. His studies led him deeply into Kabbalah, which he believed preserved ancient insights into the nature of creation. Pico argued that Hebrew letters were vessels of divine power, that sacred names revealed aspects of the divine mind, and that the structure of the cosmos could be understood through symbolic correspondences. His fusion of Kabbalah with Hermeticism laid the foundations for the ceremonial magic that would emerge in later centuries. Renaissance thinkers believed that the cosmos was a vast network of sympathies and correspondences. Every planet, metal, plant, gem, color, and sound reflected a particular aspect of divine order. When arranged correctly, these elements could create a symbolic map of the universe. Ritual depended on the careful alignment of these correspondences. A ceremony conducted under the influence of Jupiter, for example, might involve 10 sapphires, fragrances associated with growth and prosperity, and invocations that resonated with themes of abundance. This approach transformed ritual into a sophisticated symbolic system that mirrored cosmic harmony. The role of images also grew more prominent in Renaissance ceremonial magic, inspired by the Picatrix and other talismanic texts. Practitioners believed that images created under specific celestial conditions could capture and radiate astral forces. These images were not seen as representations, but as receptacles of spiritual power. A talisman depicting a lion, created during a powerful solar configuration, might be used to cultivate courage or vitality. This belief reflected an older idea that symbols were not arbitrary marks, but living expressions of cosmic principles. The Renaissance also witnessed the growth of ritual magic through the work of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, whose monumental work, 3 Books of Occult Philosophy, became one of the most influential texts in the history of ceremonial magic. Agrippa synthesized Greek philosophy, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, astrology, and medieval magic into a single unified system. He described the universe as divided into 3 worlds: the elemental, the celestial, and the intellectual. Ritual allowed the practitioner to move between these worlds by invoking the powers that governed each realm. For Agrippa, magic was not a forbidden art, but the highest expression of human wisdom, a disciplined engagement with the divine structure of the cosmos. Agrippa emphasized the importance of the magician's moral purity and inner alignment. Ritual tools, sacred names, planetary hours, and symbolic actions were all essential, but they were meaningless without a practitioner capable of wielding them with sincere intention. This emphasis on inner transformation echoed the teachings of earlier mystery traditions in Neoplatonic theurgy. Agrippa's writings would shape the development of ceremonial magic for centuries, inspiring both admiration and controversy. Another influential figure of the Renaissance was John Dee, an English mathematician, astrologer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. Dee believed that the pursuit of knowledge was a sacred calling, and that God had placed hidden truths within nature for humanity to discover. His studies of alchemy, astrology, and geometry led him to believe that the universe was permeated with divine order. In his later years, Dee sought direct communication with angels through ritual and scrying. Assisted by Edward Kelly, he developed a complex system of angelic communication that produced the language and structure now known as Enochian magic. The rituals associated with Enochian practice were elaborate, involving altars, sigils, tablets inscribed with symbolic grids, and invocations of angelic hierarchies. Dee believed that these rituals allowed him to access divine wisdom that surpassed all human knowledge. Whether one views his experiences as genuine revelations or products of intense imagination, they profoundly influenced the development of ceremonial magic. The Enochian system, with its unique language and symbolic complexity, would be revived centuries later by groups such as the Golden Dawn. Becoming a cornerstone of modern ritual magic, alchemy continued to evolve as well, serving as both a chemical and symbolic art. Renaissance alchemists refined laboratory techniques while also interpreting their work as a path of spiritual transformation. The search for the philosopher's stone symbolized the quest for inner illumination. Texts describing alchemical processes were filled with allegory, depicting the transformation of matter as a metaphor for the transformation of the soul. Ritual played an essential role in this work, from the consecration of vessels to the timing of operations according to celestial cycles. One of the most important contributions of Renaissance alchemy was the concept of correspondences between the macrocosm and the microcosm. Alchemists believed that processes occurring in their retorts mirrored cosmic processes occurring in the heavens. By engaging in these symbolic operations, they believed they were participating in the divine work of creation. The ritualistic aspects of alchemy preserved the ceremonial mindset that emphasized intention, purification, and symbolic action. The Renaissance also gave birth to new forms of magical orders and esoteric groups, though many remained secretive. These groups often drew upon Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalah, alchemy, and astrological symbolism to create initiatory structures that guided members through stages of inner development. Initiation was seen as a process of awakening, involving symbolic death and rebirth, the transmission of sacred knowledge, and the cultivation of inner discipline. These structures echoed earlier mysteries, but were shaped by the intellectual renaissance of the era. Sacred art flourished during this period, reflecting the ceremonial worldview in visual form. Painters incorporated symbolic proportions, hidden geometries, and celestial themes into their works. Churches and palaces were designed with attention to cosmic alignment, mathematical harmony, and symbolic imagery. This artistic expression reinforced the idea that beauty and divine order were intertwined, and that human creativity was a reflection of cosmic creativity. Renaissance magic was characterized by optimism and intellectual ambition. Practitioners believed that humanity stood on the threshold of a new age, one in which ancient wisdom and contemporary knowledge could unite to reveal the true structure of the universe. Ritual was not seen as superstition, but as a disciplined method of engaging with natural and spiritual laws. The magician was a philosopher, a scholar, an artist, and a seeker of divine truth. Yet this era also carried dangers. The revival of esoteric traditions often aroused suspicion, and some practitioners faced persecution for their studies. The fear of heresy and sorcery remained strong in certain regions. Nevertheless, the ideas cultivated during the Renaissance could not be easily extinguished. They spread through manuscripts, letters, and printed books, finding their way into the hands of thinkers who would carry ceremonial magic into the next phase of its evolution. By the end of the Renaissance, the foundations of modern ceremonial magic had been laid. The rediscovery of Hermetic texts, the synthesis of philosophical traditions, the development of elaborate ritual systems, and the emergence of symbolic sciences created a rich and intricate tapestry of esoteric knowledge. These ideas would continue to evolve in the centuries that followed, influencing occult societies, magical orders, and individual practitioners. The Renaissance had reawakened the ancient vision of humanity as a mediator between the earthly and the divine, being capable of shaping reality through knowledge, will, and symbolic action. As the Renaissance drew to a close, the world stood on the brink of profound transformation. New scientific discoveries, shifting religious landscapes, and the rise of modern philosophy would challenge many of the assumptions that had shaped earlier eras. Yet, the ceremonial traditions revived during the Renaissance would endure, adapting to new contexts and inspiring future generations of practitioners. The next age would see the birth of new grimoires, the refinement of ritual techniques, and the emergence of systems that combined medieval, Hermetic, and Renaissance insights into powerful ceremonial structures. As the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era, the landscape of European thought experienced another profound shift. Scientific discovery was accelerating, religious structures were being questioned, and philosophical inquiry was turning toward new methods of understanding the world. Yet, in the midst of these transformations, ceremonial magic did not fade. Instead, it evolved, adapting to new intellectual climates while preserving the symbolic systems, ritual structures, and metaphysical insights that had taken centuries to develop. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the emergence of new grimoires, the refinement of older texts, and the gradual crystallization of ceremonial magic into forms that would define its modern expression. The early modern period was shaped by paradox. On one hand, the rise of empirical science encouraged skepticism towards supernatural explanations. On the other hand, many of the era's brightest minds remained deeply influenced by esoteric traditions. Isaac Newton, for example, spent as much time studying alchemy and biblical prophecy as he did calculating the laws of nature. Robert Boyle, one of the fathers of modern chemistry, was fascinated by alchemical symbolism. Its coexistence of scientific inquiry and esoteric exploration allowed ceremonial magic to survive, albeit under increasingly cautious and private forms. The grimoires of the early modern period reflect this tension between secrecy and revelation. Many of them emerged anonymously, circulating in manuscript form before eventually appearing in print. These texts blended medieval traditions with Renaissance insights, offering practical instructions for invoking angels, constraining spirits, consecrating tools, and creating protective circles. Although their authors often framed their work as pious attempts to access divine wisdom, the rituals they described drew heavily from earlier systems of ceremonial practice. One of the most influential texts of this era was the Lesser Key of Solomon, a compilation that gathered and refined earlier magical manuscripts. Divided into sections, it presented rituals for invoking and commanding spirits, descriptions of spiritual hierarchies, and detailed instructions for constructing ritual tools. The text attributed its knowledge to the legendary King Solomon, whose wisdom was celebrated in biblical and esoteric traditions. The ritual structures described in the Lesser Key protective circles, its consecrated weapons, complex seals, and precise invocations became foundational for later ceremonial practitioners. The Ars Godia, the first section of the Lesser Key, described a hierarchy of spirits that could be summoned for various purposes. Each spirit had its own seal, characteristics, and domain of influence. Rituals required the practitioner to follow strict rules of purity, timing, and symbolic alignment. The emphasis on precise language, sacred space, and ritual authority echoed the liturgical traditions of late antiquity, though now framed within a context of angelic governance and spiritual command. Even as the modern world grew more secular, these texts preserved the ancient belief that the unseen world could be approached through disciplined ceremony. Another important text was the Heptameron, attributed to the medieval scholar Pietro di Abano. Though its origins were older, it reached wider audiences in the early modern period. The Heptameron presented rituals tied to the days of the week, each governed by a specific angelic hierarchy and planetary influence. Its instructions involved the consecration of incense, the creation of ritual circles, and the recitation of invocations aligned with celestial patterns. Its structure reflected the enduring power of planetary magic, which linked ritual action to cosmic cycles. The Grimoire of Honorius, the Sacred Magic of Abramelin, the Red Dragon, and many other texts circulated during this period, each adding new layers to the evolving landscape of ceremonial practice. The Sacred Magic of Abramelin, in particular, described a long and rigorous process of purification intended to establish contact with one's holy guardian angel. This concept preserved the ancient belief in personal spiritual guidance, echoing the demon of Greek philosophy and the intermediary spirits of Neoplatonic theurgy. The ritual emphasized purification, prayer, and moral discipline, reinforcing the idea that inner transformation was essential for successful ceremonial work. As these texts circulated, they gave rise to new communities of practitioners who studied, copied, and experimented with ceremonial methods. Some operated in secrecy to avoid accusations of heresy or sorcery. Others worked within intellectual circles, framing their practices as philosophical investigations rather than magical operations. 8. The boundary between science and magic remained fluid. Alchemists continued to use symbolic language to describe their experiments, blending laboratory work with inner transformation. Astrologers cast horoscopes not only for personal guidance, but for political and medical purposes, reflecting their belief in the interconnectedness of celestial and earthly realms. Despite growing skepticism in some quarters, many philosophers remained captivated by esoteric ideas. The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, although their origins remain mysterious, ignited widespread interest in the idea of a hidden brotherhood devoted to spiritual enlightenment and the advancement of science. These manifestos blended Christian mysticism, alchemical symbolism, and Hermetic philosophy, suggesting that true wisdom lay in the union of knowledge, virtue, and divine revelation. Even though the existence of the Rosicrucian order remains debated, the ideas they inspired shaped the development of ceremonial magic by reinforcing the ideal of an initiated community dedicated to spiritual and intellectual refinement. Freemasonry emerged during this period as well, eventually becoming one of the most influential fraternal organizations in the Western world. Although not strictly a magical order, Freemasonry incorporated symbolic rituals, initiatory degrees, allegorical teachings that reflected Hermetic and alchemical themes. Its emphasis on moral development, symbolic architecture, and the pursuit of light echoed the esoteric traditions of earlier centuries. The Masonic fascination with geometry, harmony, and cosmic symbolism would eventually influence later magical orders that drew heavily from Masonic ritual structure. The growth of secret societies during the 18th century reflected a cultural shift toward private, structured pathways of spiritual exploration. As religious institutions sought to regulate belief and scientific authorities questioned supernatural claims, esoteric groups offered safe environments for studying symbolic wisdom. These societies often blended philosophical discussion with ritual practice, creating a space where ceremonial magic could evolve under new conditions. Their members included scholars, artists, scientists, and nobles, indicating that esoteric inquiry remained attractive across social boundaries. The Enlightenment introduced another paradox. On the surface, it celebrated reason, empirical observation, and skepticism toward tradition. Yet many Enlightenment thinkers remained fascinated by esoteric symbolism, viewed ancient myths as expressions of timeless truths, alchemical allegories as metaphors for psychological transformation, and ceremonial rites as symbolic maps of the human soul. The tension between rational inquiry and mystical exploration shaped the development of ceremonial magic in complex ways. Instead of fading, magic adapted, becoming more philosophical, symbolic, and introspective. The rise of printing transformed the accessibility of grimoires. Texts that had once circulated only in manuscript form became available to wider audiences. This increased accessibility democratized magical knowledge, but also distorted it. Some grimoires were published with errors, omissions, or deliberate alterations. Others were sensationalized for entertainment or profit. Yet, despite these challenges, the availability of printed grimoires allowed ceremonial magic to reach new practitioners who would preserve and refine the tradition. The early modern period also saw significant development in angelology and demonology. Scholars debated the nature of spiritual beings, their roles in creation, and their relationships to humanity. Some adopted a moral dualism influenced by Christian theology, distinguishing sharply between angels and demons. Others, influenced by Hermetic and Neoplatonic thought, saw these beings as expressions of cosmic forces rather than moral entities. These differing interpretations influenced how practitioners approached ceremonial rituals involving spiritual hierarchies, even as philosophical and religious landscapes shifted. The principle of correspondence remained central to ceremonial magic. Practitioners continued to align their rituals with planetary hours, lunar phases, seasonal cycles, and symbolic elements. The belief that the universe was an interconnected system of sympathies endured, despite the rise of scientific materialism. Many early scientists, even those who contributed to the empirical method, retained a deep respect for symbolic resonance. They saw no contradiction between studying natural laws and contemplating spiritual truths. By the end of the 18th century, ceremonial magic had accumulated layers of knowledge from countless traditions: Hermeticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, medieval grimoires, Renaissance philosophy, and early scientific inquiry all contributed to a rich and complex worldview. Yet it was not until the 19th century that these strands would be woven into a fully modern form. The revival of esoteric traditions during that era would give ceremonial magic a new vocabulary, new organizational structures, and renewed vitality. The early modern period had preserved essential elements of the ceremonial tradition: the importance of sacred language, the role of symbolic tools, the structure of ritual space, the hierarchy of spiritual beings, and the transformative power of disciplined action. These ideas would soon be reshaped by the occult revival, which sought to recover ancient wisdom and adapt it to contemporary spiritual needs. The next era would introduce new magical orders, elaborate correspondences, and systematic approaches that would define ceremonial magic as it is known today. As the 18th century drew to a close, the old and new worlds of ritual stood poised for convergence. The intellectual curiosity of the Renaissance, the symbolic richness of medieval traditions, and the philosophical depth of antiquity would all re-emerge in the hands of 19th century magicians who saw themselves as heirs to a lineage stretching back through millennia. The landscape of ceremonial magic was preparing for another transformation, one that would carry it into the modern age with renewed purpose and unprecedented complexity. When the 19th century opened, Europe was standing at a crossroads between old belief and modern certainty. Scientific discoveries continued to reshape the understanding of nature, yet this same scientific momentum awakened a deeper curiosity about the mysteries of consciousness, symbolism, and the unseen. As industrialization transformed cities and social structures, many individuals felt a growing desire to reconnect with the spiritual wisdom of earlier ages. Within this energetic tension, ceremonial magic underwent a powerful revival. Its ancient currents resurfaced in new forms, guided by thinkers who believed that humanity still carried within it the ability to touch divine realms through disciplined ritual, symbolic knowledge, and awakened will. The 19th century occult revival did not emerge suddenly. It was the culmination of centuries of preserved traditions, rediscovered manuscripts, and philosophical transformations. Scholars had long been translating Hermetic, Kabbalistic, alchemical, and astrological works. Freemasonry had already established widespread interest in symbolic ritual, while Rosicrucian legends continued to inspire seekers who believed in hidden brotherhoods guarding ancient wisdom. These various threads converged into a movement that sought not only to study esoteric knowledge, but to practice it through structured systems that mirrored the complexity of earlier ceremonial traditions. One of the earliest and most influential voices of the 19th century revival was Eliphas Levi, a French magician, philosopher, and mystic whose writings shaped the course of modern ceremonial magic. Levi believed that the universe was permeated by a subtle force that connected all things. He described this force through a symbolic language that blended Hermeticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, astrology, and Christian mysticism. Levi revived the idea of the magician as a figure who combined moral purity, intellectual rigor, and symbolic insight. He presented magic as a sacred science grounded in the interplay between will, imagination, and universal law. Levi emphasized the importance of symbols, believing that they were the vehicles through which divine forces communicated their nature. He popularized the image of the pentagram as a protective symbol, interpreting it as a representation of the harmony between spirit and matter. His interpretation of tarot cards as keys to cosmic and psychological truths laid the foundation for the magical use of tarot in later ceremonial systems. Levi argued that every symbol was a doorway into a deeper reality, and that understanding these doorways granted access to the hidden architecture of the universe. The 19th century was a time of intellectual exploration, and Levi's ideas resonated with readers who were fascinated by the intersection of science, spirituality, and symbolic meaning. His books inspired a new generation of magicians, philosophers, and seekers who believed that ceremonial magic offered a path toward deeper understanding, not only of the cosmos, but of the human soul. Levi's influence echoed across Europe, shaping the development of magical orders and inspiring practical experimentation with ritual and symbolism. The rise of spiritualism in the mid-19th century further transformed the landscape of esoteric thought. Spiritualists believed that communication with spirits was possible through mediums, seances, and trance states. Although spiritualism focused more on communication with the departed than on ceremonial structure, it contributed to the growing belief that consciousness could extend beyond ordinary physical boundaries. Many early ceremonial practitioners attended seances not for their entertainment value, but as evidence that the unseen world was accessible through disciplined technique. Meanwhile, scholars in Germany, France, and Britain were studying ancient languages, rediscovering Gnostic texts, and developing new approaches to mythology and comparative religion. These intellectual currents enriched the symbolic vocabulary of ceremonial magic. Practitioners found new correspondences, new divine names, and new ways of interpreting ancient myths as expressions of universal truths. The rediscovery of ancient Egyptian culture, catalyzed by the decipherment of hieroglyphs, fueled esoteric fascination with Egyptian symbolism. The image of the magician became linked with the priesthood of Egypt, whose temples were believed to guard secret knowledge of cosmic forces. The 19th century also witnessed the formation of new esoteric societies that sought to blend ancient wisdom with modern practice. Among these were Rosicrucian groups that claimed lineage from earlier mystical fraternities, though their historical continuity remains debated. These organizations reflected the enduring appeal of structured initiation, symbolic ritual, and the pursuit of hidden knowledge. They offered their members a path of inner development through the study of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, and the symbolic interpretation of Scripture. However, it was the formation of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in 1888 that marked the beginning of a new era in ceremonial magic. The Golden Dawn synthesized centuries of esoteric knowledge into a comprehensive system of ritual, symbolism, and spiritual development. Drawing upon the teachings of Eliphas Levi, the writings of medieval and Renaissance magicians, the correspondences of Kabbalah, and the visionary practices of earlier mystical traditions, the Golden Dawn created a structured approach to ceremonial magic that would influence generations of practitioners. The Golden Dawn was organized into a series of initiatory grades, each corresponding to a stage of spiritual development. These grades reflected the structure of the Kabbalistic tree of life, a symbolic map of creation consisting of interconnected spheres representing different aspects of divine manifestation. As initiates progressed through the grades, they studied symbolism, meditation, astrology, alchemy, tarot, and ritual technique. Each grade introduced new knowledge, new responsibilities, and new ritual experiences intended to refine the mind and awaken deeper levels of consciousness. Ritual formed the core of the Golden Dawn's system. Initiates practiced elaborate ceremonies that involved precise movements, invocations, visualizations, and symbolic tools. The lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, one of the most enduring rituals created by the Golden Dawn, used gestures and sacred names to purify space and align the practitioner with divine presence. Other rituals invoked angelic hierarchies, explored astral realms, and facilitated inner transformation. These ceremonies reflected the belief that ritual did not merely influence the external world, but reshaped the practitioner's inner landscape, preparing the mind for higher states of awareness. The Golden Dawn's emphasis on imagination as a spiritual faculty revealed a continuity with earlier traditions. Practitioners were taught to visualize symbols, beings, and realms with clarity, believing that the imagination acted as a bridge between physical and spiritual realities. This approach echoed the teachings of Proclus and other Neoplatonists, who viewed the imagination as a vehicle for perceiving divine truths. The Golden Dawn refined this idea into a system of astral work in which practitioners explored inner worlds that mirrored symbolic patterns found in ritual and myth. The use of tarot within the Golden Dawn system built upon Levi's earlier work, but expanded it into an intricate symbolic system. Practitioners assigned each tarot card correspondences to Hebrew letters, astrological forces, elemental principles, and stages of spiritual development. Tarot became not only a tool for divination, but a guide for meditation, ritual, and inner journeying. The symbolic richness of tarot allowed practitioners to access deeper layers of meaning within ritual experiences. The Golden Dawn did not exist in isolation. It attracted poets, scholars, and artists who contributed to its development and carried its ideas into broader cultural spheres. W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, saw ceremonial magic as a means of accessing the wellsprings of creativity and mythic consciousness. Other members used ritual to explore psychological landscapes, blending esoteric symbolism with the emerging language of psychology. This intersection between ceremonial magic and the study of the mind would shape the development of 20th century magical practice. As the 19th century drew to a close, ceremonial magic had become a sophisticated system that integrated ancient traditions with modern insights. It offered practitioners a path of personal transformation grounded in ritual, symbolism, and disciplined study. The Golden Dawn stood as a culmination of centuries of development, yet it also marked the beginning of a new phase. The next century would witness the rise of new movements, new interpretations, and new approaches that would reshape ceremonial magic once again. The 20th century would bring both turbulence and creativity. The collapse of the Golden Dawn, the emergence of new magical philosophies, and the increasing influence of psychology would transform the landscape of ritual practice. Yet the foundational work of the 19th century occult revival ensured that ceremonial magic would continue to evolve as a living tradition, carried forward by individuals who saw in its symbols a profound reflection of the human quest for understanding. By the end of the 19th century, ceremonial magic had re-emerged as a dynamic and transformative practice. The rediscovery of ancient wisdom, the synthesis of esoteric traditions, and the creation of structured ritual systems had given it new vitality. The stage was set for the next era in which ceremonial magic would expand beyond scholarly circles into broader cultural movements, exploring new dimensions of will, imagination, and spiritual expression. As the 19th century passed into the 20th, ceremonial magic entered a new era of transformation. The foundations laid by Hermeticism, Renaissance symbolism, Rosicrucian myth, and the Golden Dawn provided a powerful architecture for ritual practice. Yet the dawn of the new century brought new forces that reshaped how magicians understood themselves, the universe, and the nature of spiritual work. Psychology emerged as a scientific discipline. World wars shattered established ways of thinking, and new cultural movements challenged traditional structures. Amid these upheavals, ceremonial magic continued to evolve, absorbing new insights even as it preserved the symbolic wisdom of earlier ages. The dissolution of the Golden Dawn at the start of the century marked a turning point. Internal conflicts, personal rivalries, and organizational disputes fractured the order, scattering its members into various splinter groups. Yet this scattering did not diminish the influence of the Golden Dawn. Instead, it carried its methods into new contexts. Former members continued their studies independently, refining the rituals, correspondences, and symbolic systems they had learned. Some founded new orders, while others developed unique personal paths that blended ceremonial structure with individual insight. One of the most influential figures to emerge from this transition was Aleister Crowley. A former member of the Golden Dawn, Crowley absorbed its teachings but moved beyond them to create his own philosophical and magical system. Crowley believed that humanity was entering a new age, which he called the Aeon of Horus. In this new era, he argued, the central principle would be the discovery of true will, the deep and authentic purpose that expressed each individual's unique nature. To articulate this vision, he wrote the Book of the Law, a text he claimed to have received through a spiritual communication. Crowley's system, known as Thelema, combined ceremonial ritual with a radical emphasis on individual will. The famous phrase, at the core of Thelema, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," was not a call to indulgence, but a call to self-discovery. Ritual, meditation, and symbolic engagement were tools for uncovering the true will, aligning the practitioner with a deeper spiritual current. While Thelema drew upon the structure of the Golden Dawn, it added new layers of symbolism, including Egyptian deities, astral practices, and sexual symbolism. Crowley expanded the Enochian rituals he had inherited from the Golden Dawn, treating them as gateways to specific spiritual realms. He developed his own interpretations of tarot, astrology, and Kabbalah, producing a vast body of work that influenced ceremonial magic throughout the century. Crowley's approach was bold and uncompromising, reflecting the dynamic and restless spirit of the era. Some embraced his ideas enthusiastically, while others rejected them, yet few could ignore the impact of his contribution. The influence of psychology on ceremonial magic grew significantly during this period. The works of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and later depth psychologists provided new frameworks for understanding symbols, dreams, and the unconscious mind. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, with its archetypes and universal patterns, resonated deeply with magicians who had long worked with symbolic systems. Ritual began to be understood not only as a means of interacting with external spiritual forces, but also as a method of shaping the psyche, integrating unconscious material and exploring inner landscapes. Some practitioners believed that spirits, gods, and angelic beings were manifestations of the psyche, while others saw these interpretations as complementary rather than contradictory. The psychological approach offered new language for describing altered states of consciousness, visionary experiences, and symbolic transformation. Magicians now understood ritual as a process that engaged the whole self, blending imagination, emotion, and intention into coherent action. During the 20th century, new magical orders emerged, each interpreting ceremonial magic in unique ways. The Ordo Templi Orientis, influenced heavily by Crowley, developed rituals that combined Masonic structure, sexual symbolism, and Thelemic philosophy. The builders of the Adytum emphasized spiritual development through meditation on tarot and Kabbalah. The Society of the Inner Light, founded by Dion Fortune, merged ceremonial structure with psychic development and mystical Christianity. Fortune believed that ritual created a framework for interacting with subtle energies, shaping not only the practitioner but the environment. Dion Fortune was one of the most influential ceremonial magicians of the century. Her writings describe the subtle architecture of the astral plane, the nature of spiritual beings, and the role of ritual in shaping consciousness. She emphasized the importance of ethical behavior, inner discipline, and collective work. Fortune believed that groups of practitioners could construct astral temples through visualization, creating shared symbolic spaces where ritual could unfold even beyond physical boundaries. Her approach reflected a shift toward understanding magic as a blend of psychological and spiritual processes. The rise of anthropological studies also influenced ceremonial magic. Scholars such as James Frazer and Margaret Murray proposed theories about the origins of ritual, the role of myth in society, and the survival of ancient religious practices. Although some of their theories were later criticized, they inspired practitioners to see magic as part of a broader human tradition that extended across cultures and eras. This encouraged a more comparative approach to ritual, one that sought universal principles beneath the diverse cultural expressions. The mid-20th century brought new challenges and new transformations. World War I and World War II created widespread trauma, shaking the foundations of civilization. Many turned to spiritual practices for comfort, seeking meaning amid devastation. Ceremonial magic adapted to this shifting emotional landscape, becoming more introspective and more focused on psychological healing. Practitioners began to explore how ritual could restore inner balance, integrate trauma, and cultivate resilience. The emergence of modern witchcraft, particularly the tradition of Wicca founded by Gerald Gardner, introduced new elements into the landscape of ceremonial practice. Although Wicca differed from ceremonial magic in structure and cosmology, it borrowed heavily from Golden Dawn symbolism, planetary correspondences, and ritual framework. Gardner's early rituals included pentagram work, elemental invocation, and circle casting, all of which carried the influence of ceremonial magic. This blending demonstrated how deeply ceremonial structures had penetrated modern esoteric thought. As the 20th century progressed, interest in esoteric traditions expanded dramatically. The counterculture movement of the 1960s embraced magic, symbolism, and altered states of consciousness. Psychedelic exploration, influenced by the work of Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, and others, encouraged seekers to view ritual as a method for accessing visionary realms. Some practitioners integrated ceremonial magic with meditation, yoga, and Eastern philosophies, creating hybrid systems that reflected the global exchange of ideas. This period also intensified the psychological interpretation of magic. Some practitioners viewed deities and spirits as archetypes, symbols representing aspects of the psyche. Ritual became a tool for psychological integration, allowing practitioners to confront fears, awaken potentials, and explore the hidden depths of the mind. Imaginal work, influenced by Jung and later thinkers like James Hillman, transformed ceremonial magic into a vehicle for inner journeying. Practitioners learned to navigate symbolic landscapes with greater sophistication, understanding that the line between inner and outer worlds was far more fluid than previously believed. Yet even as psychological interpretations gained prominence, other practitioners held firmly to the belief in the objective reality of spiritual beings. They argued that ritual opened doors to realms that existed independently of the human mind, accessible through disciplined practice. These differing views did not fragment ceremonial magic, but enriched it, creating a spectrum of approaches that allowed practitioners to explore the unseen according to their own beliefs and experiences. By the late 20th century, the structure of ceremonial magic had expanded far beyond its earlier forms. New orders emerged, new grimoires were written, and new methods of ritual were developed. Advances in technology allowed for the rapid exchange of ideas, exposing practitioners to a vast array of traditions. The golden threads of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, alchemy, and theurgy continued to guide ritual work, but now they were woven together with insights from psychology, anthropology, world religions, and personal experimentation. Despite the diversity of modern approaches, the core principles of ceremonial magic remained intact. Practitioners still believed in the power of symbolic action, the importance of intention, and the transformative potential of ritual. Sacred language, sacred tools, sacred timing, and sacred space continued to shape the structure of ceremonies. The quest for alignment with higher forces persisted, whether interpreted as cosmic energies, divine intelligences, or archetypal patterns within the psyche. As the 20th century drew to a close, ceremonial magic stood at the threshold of a new era. The next century would introduce digital technologies, global interconnectedness, and new philosophical paradigms. Yet the foundations laid during the early and mid-20th century ensured that ceremonial magic would continue to evolve as a dynamic and living tradition. It had survived the collapse of empires, the rise of scientific materialism, and the shifting tides of cultural belief. It remained a testament to humanity's enduring desire to understand the unseen and to shape the world through knowledge, will, and imagination. The stage was set for the 21st century, in which ceremonial magic would encounter new tools, new visions, and new possibilities. The rituals of earlier ages would not disappear. Instead, they would transform once more, adapting to a world in constant motion while preserving the timeless currents that had guided practitioners for thousands of years. As the 20th century progressed into its final decades, ceremonial magic entered a phase of unprecedented diversification. The world had become interconnected through rapid communication, global travel, and emerging digital technologies. Ideas that once required years of correspondence or rare manuscripts could now be exchanged instantly across continents. This new accessibility did not diminish the depth of ceremonial traditions. Instead, it encouraged the flowering of experimentation, interpretation, and synthesis. Practitioners rediscovered forgotten texts, created new systems, blended diverse spiritual philosophies, and explored the boundaries between consciousness and ritual with a renewed sense of possibility. The intellectual climate of the late 20th century was shaped by several movements that influenced ceremonial magic in subtle and profound ways. Humanistic and transpersonal psychology encouraged individuals to explore inner experience as a legitimate dimension of human development. Scholars of religion began to study mystical traditions with greater openness, recognizing the symbolic richness and psychological sophistication of esoteric practices. At the same time, the rise of comparative mythology, influenced by thinkers such as Joseph Campbell, helped practitioners see myth not as outdated belief, but as a living map of human experience. These currents provided a cultural framework in which ceremonial magic could flourish without the stigma that had overshadowed earlier centuries. The continuing influence of the Lema shaped much of the 20th century's ceremonial landscape. Crowley's writings remained contentious, but they inspired a broad spectrum of practitioners who interpreted his ideas through different lenses. Some adopted the Lema as a complete spiritual system, performing rituals drawn from Crowley's adaptations of Golden Dawn ceremonial structure. Others saw the Lema as a symbolic philosophy, using its emphasis on true will as a guide for self-discovery rather than ritual work. Still others combined thelemic principles with insights from psychology, tantra, or Eastern meditation, creating hybrid paths that reflected the spirit of the age. The Ordo Templi Orientis, influenced heavily by Crowley's work, continued to evolve after his death. It developed a formal initiatory system that included symbolic rituals, ethical teachings, and practical magical instruction. It attracted individuals interested in combining ceremonial structure with sexual symbolism, mystical philosophy, and a deep exploration of the inner self. Its rituals blended Masonic forms with thelemic content, creating a unique synthesis that reflected both the heritage of ceremonial magic and the innovations of the 20th century. Stian Fortune's legacy also continued to grow, influencing countless practitioners interested in psychic development and mystical Christianity. Her belief that ritual could construct inner worlds accessible to groups became a foundational concept in modern magical practice. Practitioners experimented with astral temples, symbolic landscapes created through group visualization, where rituals could unfold in shared imaginative space. This development reflected the increasing understanding of imagination as a powerful faculty, one that bridged the divide between inner experience and outer reality. Meanwhile, the work of Israel Regardie played a crucial role in preserving the legacy of the Golden Dawn. Regardie published the orders, rituals, and teachings, believing that such knowledge should be publicly accessible rather than confined to secret circles. Although controversial at the time, his decision ensured that the Golden Dawn system would survive intact, allowing future practitioners to study its structure without relying on fragmented or incomplete sources. This publication shaped the trajectory of modern ceremonial magic, making the Golden Dawn the foundation upon which many contemporary systems would be built. As ceremonial magic became more accessible, practitioners developed new methods of study and practice. Some formed small groups dedicated to specific traditions, while others experimented independently. The late 20th century saw the rise of solitary practitioners who combined ceremonial ritual with meditation, dream work, and personal symbolism. These individuals crafted rituals tailored to their own psychological and spiritual needs, reflecting the broader cultural shift toward individual expression and self-guided exploration. One of the most significant developments of this era was the emergence of chaos magic, a movement that challenged traditional ceremonial structures while preserving the core idea that intention and symbolic action could shape reality. Chaos magicians argued that belief itself was a tool rather than a fixed doctrine. They experimented with sigils, spontaneous ritual, and psychological techniques designed to alter consciousness swiftly and effectively. Although chaos magic differed from traditional ceremonial forms, it shared the same fundamental goal: to harness the power of will and imagination to transform experience. This movement introduced a new emphasis on flexibility, innovation, and personal interpretation, influencing even those who continued to practice more structured ceremonial systems. The rise of neo-pagan and witchcraft traditions in the 20th century also influenced ceremonial magic. While Wicca and related paths focused on nature-based spirituality, many borrowed heavily from ceremonial correspondences, planetary symbolism, and ritual techniques. Circle casting, elemental invocation, and symbolic tools such as wands and chalices all carried traces of ceremonial heritage. In return, ceremonial practitioners began to incorporate more nature-based symbolism into their work, blending celestial and terrestrial forms of spirituality. This cross-pollination demonstrated the adaptability of ceremonial magic and its ability to integrate insights from diverse traditions. As anthropology and folklore studies continued to expand, practitioners gained a deeper appreciation for the ritual systems of indigenous cultures, while serious ethical considerations arose regarding cultural appropriation. Many ceremonial magicians approached these traditions with respect, seeking to understand universal principles of ritual structure, symbolic meaning, and altered states of consciousness. Some integrated concepts such as shamanic journeying or rhythmic trance into their practice, adapting them through thoughtful, symbolic frameworks rather than direct imitation. This integration reflected a growing understanding that ceremonial magic was part of a broader human exploration of the sacred. The development of meditation techniques within modern spiritual movements also influenced ceremonial magic. Practitioners incorporated breathwork, mindfulness, and visualization methods drawn from Eastern traditions into ritual practice. These techniques provided new ways to focus intention, quiet the mind, and prepare consciousness for symbolic engagement. Some ceremonial magicians interpreted Eastern teachings through Hermetic frameworks, seeing parallels between concepts such as prana, chi, K, and the subtle energies described in Western esoteric texts. Technology increasingly shaped the magical landscape as the century progressed. The internet created new spaces for discussion, study, and experimentation. Practitioners shared rituals, correspondences, and symbolic interpretations across vast distances. Online communities formed around specific traditions, offering support and guidance to individuals who might never have access to local groups. This democratization of knowledge expanded ceremonial magic's reach, allowing it to grow in directions that reflected the needs and imaginations of a global population. Digital tools also introduced new symbolic possibilities. Some practitioners experimented with computer-generated sigils, interpreting digital space as a new astral realm shaped by information and intention. Others explored the symbolic potentials of virtual reality, imagining it as a medium for constructing ritual environments or astral temples. While these developments were still in their early stages, they reflected an ongoing trend. Ceremonial magic adapted not by abandoning its past, but by incorporating new technologies into its symbolic structure. The integration of scientific language into magical theories also increased during this period. Some practitioners used metaphors from quantum physics, complexity theory, or neuroscience to describe magical processes. While these metaphors were often symbolic rather than literal, they offered new ways to conceptualize the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. The idea that intention could influence subtle patterns resonated with earlier Hermetic principles while providing contemporary practitioners with vocabulary that bridged spirituality and science. Despite these innovations, traditional ceremonial magic remained a living and evolving system. Practitioners continued to study the Kabbalistic tree of life, explore the symbolism of tarot, invoke angelic hierarchies, and perform rituals aligned with planetary hours. Groups dedicated to Golden Dawn-style practice developed variations of the original system, refining rituals, expanding teachings, and adapting the tradition to contemporary spiritual needs. The core understanding that ritual could shape consciousness and reveal hidden dimensions of experience remained central. The late 20th century also saw the rise of new interpretations of older traditions. Scholars re-examined the historical roots of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and alchemy, uncovering deeper layers of symbolism and philosophical insight. These academic studies enriched the understanding of ceremonial magic, providing practitioners with more accurate and nuanced perspectives on the traditions they engaged with. The boundary between academic study and magical practice grew increasingly porous, with some scholars acknowledging the experiential dimensions of esoteric work, and some practitioners embracing historical research as part of their spiritual development. By the end of the 20th century, ceremonial magic had become a diverse and vibrant landscape. It was no longer confined to secret societies or hidden manuscripts. It existed in books, study groups, online communities, solitary journals, and group rituals conducted in living rooms, forests, and temples. Yet, despite this diversity, practitioners shared a common thread: the belief that the universe was alive with symbolic meaning, and that human beings could engage with this meaning through intentional ritual. The 20th century had reshaped ceremonial magic into a tradition that embraced both structure and innovation, both ancient wisdom and contemporary insight. The next era would expand this evolution even further, as the 21st century brought digital interconnectedness, global awareness, and new questions about the nature of consciousness and reality. Yet, at the heart of these changes, the core principles of ceremonial magic endured, guiding practitioners toward the same ancient goal: alignment with the deeper forces that permeate the cosmos. The stage was set for the most modern chapter of ceremonial magic, one in which tradition and innovation would converge, revealing new possibilities for those who sought to explore the hidden patterns of existence. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, ceremonial magic entered yet another era of transformation. The digital age rewrote the very structure of communication, reshaped the ways people formed communities, and expanded access to knowledge in ways unimaginable to earlier generations. This new landscape did not diminish ceremonial magic. Instead, it broadened its reach and deepened its complexity. Ancient principles that had once traveled through temples, manuscripts, monasteries, and esoteric orders now flowed across invisible networks of light, carried through screens and shared among practitioners scattered across every corner of the world. Yet, despite these changes, the foundation of ceremonial work remained rooted in the same timeless impulse: the desire to align human intention with the deeper architecture of existence. The 21st century did not begin with the collapse of older traditions, but with their diffusion. Systems developed by the Golden Dawn, Thelema, and various 20th century orders continued to guide practitioners seeking structured, disciplined approaches to ritual. The basic framework of ceremonial practice endured: sacred space, purification, consecrated tools, invocation, visualization, and symbolic assent. What changed was not the structure, but its context. Practitioners now studied Kabbalistic correspondences while streaming lectures, practiced banishing rituals in apartments lit by city skylines, and constructed astral temples through collective visualization in online communities. The rituals were the same, yet the world around them had transformed. The digital availability of classical esoteric texts allowed practitioners unprecedented access to the foundations of ceremonial practice. Works once restricted to rare libraries or secret circles became available to anyone with curiosity and an internet connection. This democratization inspired a new wave of scholarship as individuals examined original manuscripts, compared translations, and uncovered forgotten variations of rituals. The study of ceremonial magic became more nuanced, more historically grounded, and more informed by academic research than at any time in its history. Yet, the proliferation of information created new challenges. Without the structure of initiated orders, many practitioners struggled to distinguish reliable teachings from superficial interpretations. Some embraced eclectic approaches that lacked coherence, while others sought mentors or communities to help them navigate the vast landscape of available knowledge. This tension between freedom and structure reflected a larger shift in the modern world, where individuals were expected to create their own spiritual pathways while still longing for guidance grounded in tradition. The influence of psychology on ceremonial magic increased significantly in the 21st century. Jungian ideas about archetypes, the collective unconscious, and active imagination resonated deeply with practitioners who understood ritual as a journey through symbolic landscapes. Depth psychology provided language to describe processes that ceremonial magicians had engaged with for centuries: shadow work, cation of opposites, and the transformation of inner patterns. Rituals began to reflect this awareness more explicitly, with practitioners designing ceremonies to heal trauma, explore inner archetypes, or align the conscious and unconscious selves. At the same time, neuroscience offered new insights into altered states of consciousness. Research into meditation, trance, and visualization revealed measurable changes in brain activity, lending empirical support to practices long dismissed as superstition. Magicians used these findings not as proof of supernatural forces, but as a way to understand the mechanics of consciousness itself. Ritual became a laboratory where practitioners observed how intention, rhythm, and symbolic engagement shaped perception and emotional states. This scientific awareness complemented rather than replaced traditional beliefs, enriching the practice with a deeper understanding of its psychological effects. The rise of chaos magic in the late 20th century continued to influence ceremonial practice into the new century. Chaos magicians emphasized flexibility, personal experimentation, and the belief that all magical systems were symbolic frameworks rather than literal cosmologies. This approach encouraged practitioners to treat ceremonial structures as tools rather than dogmas. Rituals became modular, adaptable to individual needs, and open to creative reinterpretation. Some practitioners used classical ceremonial forms as stable frameworks, while others blended them with sigil magic, pop culture, symbolism, or psychological techniques. This fluidity demonstrated the living nature of ceremonial magic, which had always adapted to new cultural landscapes. Despite this flexibility, many practitioners retained a deep respect for classical ceremonial systems. The Kabbalistic tree of life remained a central symbolic map, providing a structure through which initiates could chart their spiritual development. Planetary magic continued to guide rituals aligned with celestial cycles, reflecting the ancient belief in cosmic correspondences. Angelic hierarchies still served as models for understanding spiritual forces, whether interpreted metaphysically or psychologically. Even as new interpretations arose, these systems persisted because they resonated with the human mind's natural tendency to organize experience through symbolic structure. The 21st century also brought a renewed interest in theurgy, the ancient practice of invoking divine presence to elevate the soul. Modern theurgists drew upon Neoplatonic texts, Hermetic writings, and Renaissance translations to reconstruct rituals intended to awaken higher aspects of consciousness. These practices emphasized moral discipline, contemplative meditation, and symbolic ascent through divine realms. Some practitioners describe theurgic ritual as a form of communion. It's an act of aligning the inner self with the divine intelligence that permeated the cosmos. This revival connected modern ceremonial magic not only to the Golden Dawn, but to the ancient temples of Alexandria and the philosophical schools of late antiquity. Technological advances also influenced how practitioners experienced ritual. Virtual reality environments allowed individuals to construct immersive, symbolic landscapes where they could perform ceremonies surrounded by geometric light, celestial patterns, or imagined temples. Digital tools enabled the creation of interactive sigils, animated correspondences, and ritual sequences embedded in audio-visual displays. While some dismissed these innovations as distractions, others viewed them as extensions of the astral imagination. New media through which the mind could engage with symbolic reality. Online communities formed digital temples where practitioners gathered to discuss methods, share experiences, and perform synchronized rituals across continents. These gatherings demonstrated that ceremonial magic did not require physical proximity. It required shared intention, symbolic alignment, and focused awareness. Quote, practitioners adapted classical rituals to online formats, modifying gestures and visualizations to suit virtual spaces while maintaining the symbolic integrity of the work. This evolution reflected the essence of ceremonial magic: structure flexible enough to adapt, symbolism deep enough to transcend form. The 21st century's global interconnectedness encouraged a more pluralistic approach to practice. Practitioners studied rituals from Kabbalah, Sufism, Hindu Tantra, Taoist alchemy, Taoist alchemy, and shamanic traditions, seeking universal principles beneath their differences. Although careful practitioners emphasized cultural respect and avoided superficial borrowing, the broader awareness of global spiritual traditions enriched ceremonial magic's symbolic vocabulary. Some integrated breathwork from yogic traditions into ceremonial preparations. Others incorporated ecstatic movement inspired by Sufi whirling into rites of inner ascent. Still others used Taoist energy practices to enhance the flow of intention during ritual. This synthesis reflected not appropriation, but resonance, the recognition that human beings across cultures had always sought ways to reach the divine through symbolic action and transformed consciousness. At the same time, many practitioners became more conscious of historical accuracy, studying ancient texts with academic rigor. They examined the origins of Hermeticism, traced the development of Kabbalah through Jewish mysticism, and explored the philosophical roots of Neoplatonism. This research deepened their appreciation of ceremonial magic's lineage. By understanding how each tradition had developed in its cultural context, practitioners enriched their rituals with nuance and authenticity. Environmental awareness also began to influence ceremonial magic. Its concerns about climate change and ecological imbalance grew. Many practitioners felt called to reconnect ritual with the natural world. They integrated planetary magic with ecological consciousness, viewing the earth not as a symbolic abstraction, but as a living being worthy of reverence. Rituals honoring the elements gained new significance, emphasizing the interdependence of physical and spiritual realms. Some practitioners adapted classical planetary rites to reflect environmental cycles, aligning their work with solstices, lunar phases, and seasonal transitions. This shift represented a return to one of ceremonial magic's oldest foundations, the recognition that nature was a sacred text written and living symbols. The rise of trauma-informed spirituality also shaped modern ceremonial practice. Practitioners became more mindful of how ritual could activate psychological material, both healing and challenging. They adapted rituals to emphasize grounding, safety, consent, and emotional integration. This care reflected a deeper understanding of the human psyche, recognizing that true transformation required not only symbolic alignment, but emotional and somatic awareness. Through all these changes, the essence of ceremonial magic remained the same: the belief that the universe was permeated with symbolic meaning, and that human beings could engage with this meaning through intention, imagination, and disciplined action. Whether performed in ancient temples, Renaissance studies, Victorian lodges, suburban apartments, forest clearings, or online groups, ceremonial magic continued to guide seekers toward the same timeless goal: to perceive the deeper currents of existence and align themselves with the patterns that shaped both the cosmos and the inner self. By the early decades of the 21st century, ceremonial magic had become a global phenomenon practiced by people from diverse cultures, backgrounds, and perspectives. Some approached it as a spiritual path, others as a psychological discipline, and still others as an artistic expression. Yet all shared a common recognition that ritual opened a doorway between worlds, allowing the practitioner to glimpse the unity that lay beneath the surface of experience. The next stage of ceremonial magic's evolution would continue this journey, weaving together ancient lineage and modern insight into a living tradition that remained ever adaptable, ever symbolic, and ever committed to the exploration of hidden truth. As ceremonial magic progressed further into the 21st century, a noticeable shift began to unfold within its philosophical core. The older models of ritual, shaped by centuries of symbolic structure, remained alive and respected, yet practitioners increasingly sought to reconcile these classical frameworks with new insights about consciousness, identity, and the nature of personal will. This movement did not reject tradition, but reinterpreted it, advancing the ancient disciplines into new conceptual territory. The idea that ritual could transform reality now intertwined with the idea that ritual could transform perception, and that perception itself shapes the structure of lived experience. One of the most influential developments of this era was the reinterpretation of will, concept rooted deeply in the history of ceremonial magic, yet continuously re-examined by each new generation. Earlier systems had described will as the guiding force behind magical action, the inward pivot upon which ritual intention turned. Yet, modern thinkers began to explore will as an emergent property of consciousness, shaped by emotional, cognitive, and somatic experiences. Kalima had introduced the concept of true will, a deeper purpose or direction unique to each individual. Modern practitioners expanded this idea, seeing true will not as a fixed destiny, but as a dynamic alignment between inner clarity and outer participation in the world. This perspective encouraged a more fluid relationship between ritual and identity. Practitioners no longer viewed themselves as separate from the forces they invoked. Instead, they understood invocation as a process of embodying symbolic patterns that existed both within and beyond the psyche. When a practitioner invoked a planetary intelligence, for example, the ritual did not summon an external entity in a literal sense, but awakened a pattern of consciousness that resonated with the symbols, myth, and qualities associated with that planet. Ritual became an act of self-discovery as much as an act of cosmic communion. This shift reflected broader cultural movements toward understanding identity as layered, multifaceted, and constantly evolving. Modern ceremonial magicians frequently explored how symbolic archetypes influence personal development. They studied mythology not only as a historical record of human belief, but as a psychological map of human potential. Deities became not distant beings, but mirrors of inner realities, each reflecting a different facet of consciousness. Ritual practitioners found themselves journeying not only upward into celestial hierarchies, but inward into the depths of their own being. The concept of the subtle body grew increasingly important in this era. Earlier traditions had described subtle energies, astral bodies, and spiritual anatomy, but these ideas remained largely symbolic in earlier centuries. Modern practitioners, informed by somatic psychology, breathwork, and meditation research, began to explore subtle energy as an experiential phenomenon. Rituals that once focused primarily on visualization now incorporated breath, movement, and awareness of bodily sensation. The body itself became a temple of ritual, a living vessel through which intention flowed. Some practitioners developed specialized techniques for working with subtle states of awareness. They practiced rhythmic breathing to induce shifts in perception, used sensory deprivation to deepen focus, or incorporated slow, deliberate movement into ritual to anchor intention in the body. Others used sound toning, chanting, or vibrational instruments to shift consciousness. These approaches reflected the understanding that ritual was not only mental or symbolic, but embodied, and that the physical experience of ritual could profoundly shape its spiritual impact. The rise of mindfulness practices in contemporary culture also influenced ceremonial magic. While mindfulness was often taught in secular contexts, its principles harmonized naturally with ritual preparation. Practitioners used mindfulness to stabilize attention, clarify intention, and navigate the symbolic landscapes opened during ceremony. This integration did not dilute the depth of ceremonial practice, but enhanced it, giving magicians new tools to sustain focus and presence during complex rituals. Meanwhile, new theories of reality emerging from philosophy and cognitive science inspired innovative interpretations of magical practice. Some practitioners drew upon phenomenology, which emphasized that reality is experienced through consciousness rather than existing as an objective, external phenomenon. This perspective resonated with the ceremonial view that symbols shaped perception, and that perception shaped the world. Ritual was understood as a deliberate engagement with the structures of experience, way of revealing or altering the frameworks through which the mind interpreted reality. Other practitioners explored how language shaped magical action. The study of linguistics and semiotics suggested that words were not passive descriptions, but active participants in creating meaning. Sacred names, long central to ceremonial magic, were reinterpreted as powerful linguistic constructs capable of reconfiguring mental states. Ritual speech, whether muttered softly or spoken with commanding clarity, became an art of shaping the mind's symbolic environment. The ancient belief that sacred words carried power found new grounding in modern theories of language and cognition. Quantum metaphors also found their place in modern magical discourse, though practitioners approached these ideas with varying degrees of literal belief. Some saw parallels between magical intention and the observer effect, interpreting ritual as a form of conscious engagement with probability fields. Others used quantum concepts symbolically, seeing them as metaphors that illuminated spiritual principles. Regardless of interpretation, these metaphors provided practitioners with contemporary language for describing the fluidity of experience and the interplay between mind and world. As ceremonial magic absorbed these new insights, the structure of ritual began to change in subtle but significant ways. Practitioners designed ceremonies that emphasized psychological integration, ecological awareness, and personal authenticity. Banishing rituals, once used primarily to purify space, became methods for releasing internal obstacles or emotional patterns. Occasions became opportunities for exploring archetypal qualities such as courage, compassion, creativity, or discipline. The goal was no longer limited to manipulating external forces, but included cultivating inner transformation and resilience. Some groups created rituals specifically intended to navigate modern challenges. They developed ceremonies for healing collective grief, strengthening community bonds, or honoring the interconnectedness of the natural world. These rituals did not deviate from ceremonial tradition, but expanded it, demonstrating its capacity to address contemporary concerns without losing its symbolic depth. Practitioners recognized that magic was not an escape from modern life, but a way of engaging with it more intentionally, more consciously, and more creatively. Despite these expansions, the foundational elements of ceremonial magic remained intact. A sacred space continued to be marked by deliberate gestures or symbols. Practitioners still purified themselves through breath, visualization, or symbolic washing. Tools such as wands, cups, pinnacles, and daggers remained central, not for their physical properties, but for their symbolic resonance. The planetary hours retained their significance, linking ritual timing to celestial patterns. The Kabbalistic tree of life continued to offer practitioners a map of spiritual ascent, each sphere representing a stage of insight or transformation. Theurgy, too, experienced a resurgence. Modern theurgists sought to refine their character, expand their awareness, and align themselves with divine intelligence. They interpreted divine beings not as external entities demanding worship, but as emanations of a deeper reality that could be approached through disciplined contemplation. Ritual became a method of ascending through inner layers of being, clearing away illusions and awakening latent capacities. This revival emphasized humility and devotion, viewing magic as a sacred act that required reverence rather than control. These developments led to new ethical considerations within ceremonial practice. Practitioners asked what it meant to work with intention in a world where personal and collective realities were intertwined. Many concluded that the deepest form of magic was not the manipulation of external events, but the cultivation of wisdom, compassion, and responsibility. They emphasized consent, mindful intention, and respect for the autonomy of others. This ethical evolution reflected a growing recognition that ritual engaged forces that resonated through both psyche and society, and that practitioners bore responsibility for the impact of their work. The integration of trauma-informed approaches further deepened the ethical dimension of ceremonial magic. Practitioners acknowledged that ritual could evoke powerful emotions, memories, or archetypal energies. They developed techniques to maintain grounding, ensure safety, and support emotional integration. This awareness strengthened the ceremonial community, creating spaces where practitioners could explore transformation without fear of harm. Ritual became not only a tool for mystical ascent, but a pathway to healing, empowerment, and psychological wholeness. As ceremonial practice continued to evolve, practitioners began exploring new forms of symbolism unique to the 21st century. Technology itself became a source of symbolic imagery, circuits as metaphors for energetic pathways, networks as symbols of interconnectedness, digital code as a parallel to sacred language. Some magicians created rituals that reflected the rhythms of modern life, using symbols drawn from contemporary culture as gateways to archetypal meaning. This approach reflected the ceremonial tradition's core insight that symbols were living expressions of truth, adaptable to time and culture. Yet, even as new symbols emerged, ancient symbols retained their power. The pentagram continued to represent the harmony of elements. The hexagram continued to symbolize the union of opposites. The tarot continued to serve as a mirror of consciousness. These symbols endured because they resonated with universal patterns that transcended cultural change. Practitioners discovered that no matter how the world transformed, that the human psyche responded deeply to certain forms, certain numbers, certain lines of sacred geometry. By the early 21st century, ceremonial magic thus existed as a constellation of interconnected traditions. Some practitioners followed classical systems with precise fidelity. Others blended ceremonial structure with psychological insight, ecological awareness, or technological innovation. Still, others developed highly personalized systems that reflected their own symbolic language. Yet, all shared a common path: the deliberate engagement with symbols, intention, and ritual to discover the hidden patterns of existence. Ceremonial magic in this era was neither old nor new. It was timeless, continually renewing itself through each generation while preserving the ancient pulse that had guided humanity since the earliest rituals around firelit stones. Its practitioners remained explorers of consciousness, architects of symbolic reality, and seekers of the unknown. As the 21st century continued to unfold, ceremonial magic stood ready to evolve once more, carrying forward its ageless purpose into the mysteries of the future. As the 21st century continued to unfold, ceremonial magic entered a phase in which ancient lineage and modern key innovation coexisted with greater fluidity than ever before. The traditions that had once been carried through secret temples, encoded manuscripts, and disciplined initiatory orders now moved through digital networks, global communities, and interdisciplinary dialogues. Yet, despite the vast changes in context, practitioners recognize that the core impulses behind ceremonial magic have remained profoundly constant. The search for meaning, the desire for connection with unseen forces, the yearning to align human intention with deeper patterns of existence, and the instinct to express truth through symbolic action had persisted for thousands of years. It was this continuity that allowed ceremonial magic to adapt without losing its identity, expanding into forms that were uniquely suited to the unfolding future. One of the defining qualities of ceremonial magic in this era was its pluralism. Practitioners no longer felt bound to a single interpretation of reality or a single model of ritual. They recognized that different systems could coexist, each offering unique insights into the nature of consciousness and the structure of existence. For some, ceremonial beings were literal presences inhabiting subtle realms. For others, they were symbolic constructs emerging from the deep psyche. For still others, there were archetypal energies that operated on multiple levels at once. This plurality did not weaken ceremonial practice, but enriched it, allowing practitioners to explore ritual with greater openness and curiosity. The symbolic language of ceremonial magic continued to serve as a bridge between these interpretations, whether practitioners understood angelic invocations as communications with divine intelligences or as psychological processes that activated specific aspects of the psyche. The rituals themselves maintained their potency. The structure of ceremony functioned like a finely crafted instrument, capable of producing meaning regardless of the metaphysical assumptions behind it. Practitioners discovered that the power of ritual lay not in rigid belief, but in the depth of engagement, clarity of intention, and the willingness to enter symbolic space with sincerity. In this period, ceremonial magicians often described reality as layered, multidimensional, and responsive to consciousness. This idea echoed the teachings of Neoplatonists, Hermetic philosophers, Renaissance magi, and 20th century psychologists. The ancient concept of the astral plane re-emerged with new nuance. Practitioners spoke of imaginal realms, not as physical locations, but as spaces of meaning where symbols possessed their own logic. These imaginal landscapes became arenas for inner exploration, ritual enactment, and encounters with the archetypal patterns that shaped human experience. Many practitioners noticed that ritual changed as their understanding of consciousness evolved. When they performed banishings, the space felt clearer. Not because invisible entities had been expelled, but because their own minds shifted into a state of focused presence. When they invoked deities or angels, they felt qualities such as strength, clarity, compassion, or insight emerge within themselves. When they performed scrying or pathworking, they entered inner landscapes that revealed truths they had not fully recognized. Ritual became a dynamic dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious, between the personal and the transpersonal, between the known world and the symbolic world. The concept of magical responsibility became increasingly important during this era. Practitioners recognized that intention did not exist in a vacuum. It resonated through personal relationships, communities, and the broader world. Ethical frameworks emerged that emphasized self-awareness, consent, humility, and compassion. magicians understood that power without wisdom was destructive, and that true will could only be discovered through honest introspection rather than impulse or desire. This ethical maturity reflected an evolution of the ceremonial mindset, a recognition that spiritual work required not only technical skill, but moral integrity. At the same time, practitioners deepened their relationship with the natural world. The planetary correspondences that had long guided ritual became more meaningful as individuals grappled with environmental change and ecological uncertainty. The elements were no longer merely symbols, but living realities. The earth was not simply the element of stability, but a fragile and luminous presence that sustained human life. Air was not only the element of thought, but the breath shared by all beings. Water symbolized emotion and purification, yet it also represented oceans, rivers, and rain cycles now threatened by human impact. Fire signified transformation, but also climate, heat, and the danger of imbalance. Practitioners wove ecological awareness into their rituals, recognizing that the microcosm of the ceremonial circle reflected the macrocosm of the planet. This ecological consciousness inspired new ritual forms that honored the earth as a sacred being. Ceremonies incorporated natural cycles, seasonal transitions, and planetary rhythms, not only as symbolic structures, but as acts of reverence. Practitioners offered rituals to heal their relationship with the land, to cultivate environmental awareness, and to strengthen their own sense of interconnection. These practices revitalized one of the oldest layers of ceremonial tradition, the recognition that humanity is part of a living cosmos, bound to earth and sky through shared breath and shared destiny. As the century advanced, digital technologies continued to reshape ceremonial practice. Virtual reality allowed practitioners to enter immersive, symbolic environments where they could explore temples, geometric structures, and mythic landscapes. Augmented reality overlaid symbols onto physical environments, allowing digital sigils to glow on walls or planetary diagrams to overlay the night sky. Artificial intelligence generated imagery, chants, or symbolic correspondences that practitioners used to inspire rituals. While some approached these tools cautiously, others embraced them as new expressions of the ancient impulse to shape symbolic space. The blending of technology and ritual did not dilute ceremonial magic. Instead, it demonstrated that the essence of magic was not tied to any particular medium. The imagination had always constructed inner temples, and virtual reality simply extended that capacity into new forms. Sigils had always been drawn on parchment, and digital sigils were simply new surfaces for intention. Sacred space had always been created through focus and will, and online rituals demonstrated that symbolic space could emerge anywhere intention gathered. Not all practitioners embraced technological innovations. Some preferred the quiet, grounded solitude of candlelit rooms and handwritten grimoires. Others valued the discipline of physical ritual tools crafted by hand. This coexistence of approaches strengthened the tradition, reminding practitioners that ceremonial magic thrived not through uniformity, but through diversity. The tradition welcomed both the digital and the ancient, both the experimental and the classical, because its foundation lay in meaning rather than form. In this era, a new understanding of magical lineage emerged. Earlier centuries had emphasized lineage as a matter of formal initiation, passed through secret orders, while many still valued initiatory orders. Modern practitioners recognize that lineage could also be understood as a flow of wisdom across time. The writings of ancient philosophers, the practices of medieval mystics, the rituals of Renaissance magi, the innovations of 19th century occultists, and the insights of modern practitioners formed a continuous stream of exploration. To study ceremonial magic was to enter a conversation that had been unfolding for thousands of years. The lineage was not a chain of authority, but a river of inspiration, flowing through every practitioner who engaged with the work sincerely. Then this expanded understanding, the role of the magician, evolved. Practitioners no longer saw themselves as controllers of cosmic forces, but as collaborators with patterns that transcended individual identity. Magic became an art of attunement rather than domination. It required patience, humility, imagination, and reflection. Practitioners recognized that the deepest rituals were not those that produced visible phenomena, but those that produced subtle inner changes, greater clarity, deeper peace, stronger authenticity, or a more profound sense of connection with life. The rituals of ascent, which had been central to ceremonial magic for centuries, also transformed in meaning as practitioners engaged with the symbolism of rising through celestial spheres or ascending the tree of life. They did so not to escape the world, but to understand it more fully. Each stage of ascent corresponded to insights about perception, identity, and relationship. The ascent became a metaphor for unfolding awareness, revealing new dimensions of meaning within ordinary experience. As practitioners discovered that the journey upward also brought them deeper into their own lives, their relationships, and the present moment. In the process of this evolution, ceremonial magic became a path of integration. It invited practitioners to weave together mind, emotion, spirit, and body, to reconcile logic and intuition, to harmonize inner truth with outer action. Ritual became a practice of becoming whole, of aligning disparate aspects of the self into coherence. The unity that practitioners sought in the divine realms reflected the unity they cultivated within themselves. As the 21st century moved forward, ceremonial magic remained a living tradition, shaped by those who practiced it. Its future would undoubtedly bring further transformations, new interpretations, and new symbolic languages. Yet, its essence would endure, because it spoke to something enduring in the human heart. It invited individuals to step into the mystery, to explore reality through symbolic action, to honor the unseen currents that shape their lives, and to engage with existence as participants rather than spectators. Ceremonial magic had begun with ancient rituals carved into stone, with names whispered to the sky, with symbols etched in sacred chambers. It had passed through temples, mystery schools, philosophical academies, monastic libraries, alchemical laboratories, magical lodges, and digital screens. Across millennia, it had retained its identity because it reflected a fundamental truth. Human beings are meaning-making creatures who seek connection with the forces that transcend them, who shape their worlds through symbols, and who encounter the divine not only in heavens, but in the depths of their own consciousness. As long as humanity continued to seek meaning, ceremonial magic would continue to evolve, would remain a path of wonder, discipline, imagination, and transformation. It would guide seekers to the threshold of inner and outer mystery. It would reveal that the cosmos is not a distant mechanism, but a living order woven through every breath, every thought, and every act of intention. The story of ceremonial magic did not end here. It continued in the hands of every practitioner who lit a candle with purpose, traced a symbol with awareness, spoke a sacred name with reverence, or entered a ritual space with an open heart. In those moments, the ancient lineage awakened once more, alive and vibrant, carrying forward its ageless message that the universe is rich with meaning, that the unseen is never far from the seen, and that through will, imagination, and symbolic action, human beings may glimpse the hidden architecture of existence and play a conscious role within its unfolding.